Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most forgotten moments. Imagine waking up one morning to find that everything you knew, every rule, every wall that protected you, every chain that bound you, was crumbling. The castles that loomed over your village for 300 years are falling silent. The lords who controlled your life can no longer control their own fate, and you, a peasant who was invisible to history, suddenly hold all the cards. This is not a fairy tale. This happened. And what came next changed the world forever. So before we dive into this incredible story together, I have a small request. If you enjoy what you're about to hear tonight, would you consider subscribing to the channel? Maybe hit that like button, or share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you in bed with the lights low, on a night drive, washing dishes? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I love hearing from you. Now get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Let the world outside fade away. Turn down those lights. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Tonight, we're travelling back to the year 1349, to a tiny village in northern England, to witness the moment when everything changed for the people history forgot. Let me take you to a place called Waram, Percy. If you could stand there today, you would see nothing but rolling green hills in Yorkshire, gentle slopes dotted with sheep, and the faint outlines of old stone foundations barely visible in the grass. But close your eyes with me now, and let's go back. 675 years back to be exact, to a cold morning in April, 1349. The village is alive. Smoke rises from 40 small houses clustered together near a limestone church. These are not the charming cottages you might imagine from storybooks. These are rough structures, timber frames packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and yes, manure. The roofs are thatched, always leaking. The floors are dirt, often shared with chickens, a pig, maybe a cow if you're lucky. There are no windows to speak of, just small openings that let in draughts and a sliver of light. And above all of this, dominating the landscape like a giant made of stone, stands the castle. It has been there since the days of William the Conqueror. 3 centuries of watching, 3 centuries of controlling, 3 centuries of reminding everyone below, you're small and we are mighty. But on this particular morning, something feels different. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name is Agnes. We don't know if there was really an Agnes at Waram, Percy in 1349, but there were hundreds of women just like her. Agnes is 24 years old, which makes her practically middle-aged in this world. She has survived childbirth twice. Her 2 children are still alive, which is rarer than you might think. 50% of children did not see their second birthday. She has buried her mother, her younger brother, and 3 infants of her own. This is the mathematics of medieval life. Agnes is what they call a villain. Not a villain, that is something different, but a villain, spelled V-I-L-L-E-I-N. It means she is legally bound to this land. She cannot leave. She cannot marry without permission from the lord of the manor. She cannot sell her cow without paying a fine. If she wants to use the lord's mill to grind her wheat, and she must use the lord's mill, no other, she pays for that too. She owes the Lord 10% of everything she grows. She owes the church another 10%, and then there are the special taxes, marriage tax, inheritance tax, the tax for being alive, essentially. Her husband Thomas works their small strips of land 3 days a week. The other 3 days, he must work the Lord's fields for free. This is called week work. And during harvest time, he owes even more days, called boon work. This is not negotiable. This is the law, This has been the law for as long as anyone can remember. But this morning, as Agnes steps outside into the cold April air, she notices something strange. The baker's house is silent. Usually by this hour you can smell bread. Today, nothing. She walks past 3 more houses. No smoke, no sounds. She feels her stomach tighten. The plague arrived in Waram, Percy 6 months ago. They did not call it the Black Death yet. They called it the pestilence, the great mortality, God's punishment. It came up from the south, they heard, travelling faster than any army. It arrived in England in June of 1348, carried, though they did not know this, by fleas on rats on ships from the continent. The symptoms were unmistakable. First, the fever. Then, the swellings in the neck, the armpits, the groin. Painful lumps the size of apples. The skin would darken and bruise. Then came the coughing, sometimes with blood. Most people who showed symptoms were dead within 3 days, some within hours. Agnes lost her father in November. Her neighbour's entire family, 7 people, gone in a single week. Every morning brought new absences. Every evening brought the sound of digging in the churchyard. The priest, Father Edmund, worked himself to exhaustion giving last rites, until one day he too developed the fever, and there was no one left to give him his final blessing. By spring of 1349, Waram Percy had lost more than half its people. Of the 40 households that stood in 1348, perhaps 20 remained occupied. The fields that once required every able hand now stretched empty. The strips of land Agnes's family had tended for generations lay partially abandoned. And here is where the story becomes interesting. Because up at the castle, the lord and his steward were facing a problem they had never encountered before. The lord, let's call him Sir Geoffrey, a man who had inherited this land from his father, who inherited it from his father, was discovering that fear and tradition were no longer enough. Sir Geoffrey needed the harvest brought in, but there were not enough hands. He sent his steward down to the village with the usual orders. You will work the Lord's fields. You will fulfill your obligations. This is the law. But something happened that had never happened before. Thomas, Agnes's husband, said no. Let me pause here because I want you to understand how radical this was. For 300 years, since the Norman conquest of 1066, the word of the Lord had been law. You did not refuse. Refusal meant punishment. It could mean the stocks. It could mean a fine you could never pay. It could mean losing your small plot of land and watching your family starve. But Thomas looked at the steward and said, "There are 3 of us left to do the work of 10. My family is barely surviving. I cannot give the Lord 3 days. I will give him 1 day, and I need to be paid. Paid. In money. Not in permission to use the land that his grandfather and great-grandfather had used. Not in protection from bandits, though there were few bandits now. Most of them were dead too. He wanted wages." The steward, a man named Robert who appears in actual court records from this period, was stunned. He threatened. He reminded Thomas of his obligations. He spoke of the law, of tradition, of God's order. And Thomas said, "The law is dead. Half the village is in the ground. If you want me to work, you will pay me, or I will take my family to the next manor where they are paying." This was not an idle threat, because here is what the plague had done. It had created, for the first time in centuries, a labour shortage. With 30 to 60% of Europe's population dead, and we're talking about roughly 25 million people dying between 1347 and 1351, the few who survived suddenly had options. Shocking, unprecedented options. If the lord at Waram Percy would not negotiate, Thomas could walk 15 miles to the next manor, where a desperate lord might offer better terms. And the thing about medieval law is that if you could stay in a free town for 1 year and 1 day without being caught, you became legally free. The system that had seemed permanent, carved in stone like those castle walls, was suddenly full of cracks. Now, let me give you some perspective on what life had been like before this moment. 90% of Europe's population were peasants. 90%. Think about that. For every king, every knight in shining armour, every stone mason who built a cathedral, every monk who copied a manuscript, there were 9 peasants in a field, bent over, hands in the dirt, making sure everyone else had food to eat. And yet, when we think of the Middle Ages, we think of castles and knights. We think of King Arthur and noble quests. We think of anything except the people who actually made that world function. Agnes and Thomas and their children were not characters in anyone's story. They were not mentioned in chronicles. No one wrote songs about them. When the church kept records, it was to track who owed what, not to remember who they were. But on that morning in April 1349, as Agnes stood in her doorway and watched her husband refuse the steward, she witnessed the first crack in a system that had controlled her family for 10 generations. She did not know it yet, but she was standing at the beginning of the end of the feudal world. The castle on the hill, that massive structure of stone that had seemed eternal, was already beginning its long, slow decline. Oh, it would stand for many more years, but it would never again hold the same power, because power, it turns out, is not about stone walls, it is about people. And when half your people are gone, and the survivors realize they are needed more than they need you, everything changes. Over the next 150 years, castles across Europe would begin to fall silent. Not all at once, not dramatically. But gradually, inevitably, the nobles would lose their grip. The peasants would walk away. The fields would be abandoned or rented for cash instead of servitude. The great fortresses would become too expensive to maintain. The walls would crack, the roofs would cave in, and eventually many would be left to the sheep and the wind. But that is getting ahead of our story. Let me bring you back to Waram Percy, to Agnes, standing in her doorway. The steward has stormed off, red-faced, muttering about the Lord's displeasure. Thomas has returned to his strip of land, shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of having done something impossible. Agnes does not speak. She simply walks to him, touches his shoulder, and they stand together, looking at the earth that has held their family in place for so long. For the first time in their lives, they can imagine leaving. They can imagine negotiating. They can imagine a future that is not identical to the past. This is the moment I wanted you to see. Not the moment a king signed a document. Not the moment an army won a battle. But this quiet moment in a tiny village in northern England, when 2 people who were supposed to be powerless discovered they had power after all. The world was changing. The castles were falling, and the people nobody remembered were about to shape the next 500 years of history. They would rebel, they would negotiate, they would migrate, they would fail and try again. They would be crushed and rise back up, and slowly, generation by generation, they would build the world we live in now. Because here is the truth that history often forgets. Massive changes do not start with kings. They start with ordinary people who one day say, no more. Or sometimes even more powerfully, not enough. I want better. Agnes and Thomas did not know they were making history. They were just trying to survive. They were just trying to feed their children and maybe, just maybe, keep 1 extra bushel of wheat for themselves. but their small act of resistance, multiplied by thousands of similar moments across thousands of villages, would eventually break a system that had seemed unbreakable. So as we stand here in Waram, Percy on this April morning in 1349, I want you to remember this. The story we're about to explore together is not just about the past. It is about how change happens, how people gain freedom, how systems fall, and how the people at the bottom sometimes against all odds reshape the world. Agnes is going to go back inside her small dark house now. She will make pottage, a thick soup of whatever vegetables and grain she has, for her children. Thomas will work his field, keeping one eye on the castle, wondering if the Lord will send men to force his compliance. The steward will report back, and Sir Geoffrey will have to make a choice he never thought he would face. Compromise with a peasant, or watch his harvest rot in the fields. And across Europe, in thousands of villages just like this one, the same choice is being made. The same cracks are appearing, the same impossible questions are being asked, and the answers will remake the world. But to understand where they are going, we need to understand where they have been. We need to see just how tightly the system had bound them, and why it took a catastrophe to break those bonds. We need to walk through their lives, not as statistics in a history book, but as people. Complicated, struggling, hoping people. So let's step back for a moment. Let's look at what life was really like for Agnes and Thomas before the plague. Let's explore the system that controlled them, the castles that loomed over them, and the daily realities that medieval historians often gloss over. Because if you want to understand why this moment matters, you need to understand what they were fighting against. And trust me, what you're about to discover might surprise you. The medieval world was stranger, harsher, and more complex than most people imagine. But it was also, in its own way, more human than we often give it credit for. So take a breath, settle in. We have a long journey ahead of us tonight, and it begins with understanding the weight of the chains before we can celebrate their breaking. It begins with seeing the castle not as a fairy tale, but as the economic, military and psychological prison it truly was. And it begins with asking a question that will guide us through the next several hours. When the castles fell, what happened to the people who had lived their entire lives in their shadow? The answer is more complicated, more dramatic, and more relevant to your life today than you might think. So let's continue this journey together. Let's walk deeper into the world Agnes knew, before everything changed. Let's discover what it truly meant to live under the shadow of those stone walls, and why their falling was both terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. When you hear the word peasant, what image comes to mind? Be honest. Maybe you're picturing someone dirty, ignorant, bowing and scraping before their betters. Maybe you're thinking of a simple-minded farmer who did not know any better, who accepted their fate because they could not imagine anything else. Let me tell you right now, that image is wrong, dangerously wrong, and it is exactly the image the nobility wanted everyone to believe. The truth is far more interesting, far more complicated, and honestly, far more impressive. So before we can understand why the system collapsed, we need to understand how it actually worked. Not the fairy tale version, the real version. The version with numbers and sweat and impossible choices. Let's talk about money. Or rather, let's talk about everything you never had but always owed. Picture this. You are a peasant family in Nottingham in the year 1300. Not during the plague. We're going back a generation before that, to when the system was still functioning exactly as designed. Your name is William. You have a wife, Margaret, and 4 children, though you know statistically at least 2 of them probably will not survive to adulthood. You try not to think about that too much. You hold 30 acres of land. Now, before you think 30 acres that sounds like a lot, let me stop you right there. First, you do not own this land, you hold it. There is a massive difference. The Lord owns it. You have the right to work it, to live on it, and if you are lucky, to pass that right to your eldest son when you die. But only if you have paid all your debts. And oh, do you have debts? Let's break down your economic reality, shall we? This is where it gets wild. Every year you owe the Lord roughly 10% of everything you produce. That is called a rent. Though you're not paying for an apartment, you're paying for the privilege of working yourself to exhaustion. Some years, when the harvest is good, 10% feels manageable. Most years, when the harvest is mediocre, it hurts. And every few years when the harvest fails, it might kill you. But wait, we are just getting started. You also owe the church a tithe. That is another 10%. Tithe literally means tenth. 10% of your grain, your vegetables, your animals, your labour. You cannot negotiate this. It is God's law. You owe it to the parish church, which is usually just a small stone building down the road, presided over by a priest who may or may not be particularly holy, but who definitely keeps very careful records of what you owe. So we are already at 20% of everything you produce, gone. But hold on, because we are nowhere near finished. You want to grind your wheat into flour? You cannot do that yourself, even if you built your own mill. That would be illegal. You must use the Lord's mill, and the Lord's mill charges a fee, usually about 1/16 of your grain. Oh, and you want to bake that flour into bread? You must use the Lord's oven, another fee. Your daughter wants to get married? That is a marriage fine. Could be a few chickens, could be a week's wages. Depends on the Lord's mood and how much he thinks you can afford. Your father just died and you're inheriting his land rights? That is a heriot. Basically an inheritance tax. Usually it is your best animal. So if you had one decent ox that you needed to plough your fields next season, well, the Lord gets it. Hope you can borrow one from a neighbour. Oh, and here is a fun one. You cannot leave the manor. Legally, you are bound to this land. If you try to run away and you are caught, there are serious consequences. Fines you cannot afford. Time in the stocks, maybe worse. The castle on the hill is not just a symbol of protection, it is a very physical reminder that you are not free. Now let me tell you about week work. This is the part that would absolutely infuriate you if you were living it. 3 days a week, sometimes more during planting and harvest, you must work the Lord's fields, not your fields, his fields, for free. Well, not exactly free. The payment is that you get to keep living on the land and he does not evict you. Generous, right? So let me do the math with you. There are 7 days in a week. On Sunday, you are supposed to rest. That is God's day. And actually, this is one rule most people did observe because everyone was genuinely exhausted. That leaves 6 working days. 3 of those days you are working for the Lord. That is 50% of your labour, just gone. On the other 3 days, you're trying to work your own strips of land, maintain your house, repair your tools, take care of your animals, and somehow produce enough food to feed your family after you've given away 20% of it. Can you imagine? Can you actually imagine working for someone else for free half of your working life, and then giving away a fifth of whatever you manage to produce on your own time, and doing this knowing that your grandfather did it, and his grandfather did it, and your children will do it, and their children forever? But here is what blows my mind. Despite all of this, peasants were not stupid. This is so important. They knew exactly how the system worked. They knew they were being exploited. They knew the math did not add up in their favour. Medieval peasants had sophisticated agricultural knowledge that we have forgotten today. They understood crop rotation, soil fertility, weather patterns, animal husbandry. They had to, because one mistake could mean starvation. They also knew the law, better than you might think. Medieval court records, and yes, these records survive, thousands of them, show peasants arguing legal points, negotiating terms, finding loopholes. They were not passive victims. They were people trapped in a system that gave them almost no options, but they pushed against every boundary they could find. Let me give you a real example from the historical records. In 1304, in the manor of Kettering Abbey, there was a detailed account of what the villeins, the bound peasants, owed. One villain held 30 acres and owed 2 shillings and 1 denarius per year. That is about $63 in today's money, which might not sound like much until you realize there was probably several months of what we would call cash income. Most of their wealth was in goods, not money. This same villain also owed 3 days of work per week for most of the year, and extra days during harvest. He had to provide a certain number of eggs at Easter. He had to maintain the roads. He had to help prepare the Lord's buildings. The list goes on. And you could not just pay money instead of doing the work, even if you had money. The Lord needed your labour. He needed bodies in the fields. Because here is the secret. The whole system only worked because there were lots of peasants and not very many lords. The nobility was maybe 1 or 2% of the population. They needed everyone else to be locked in place, working, producing, unable to leave. That castle looming over your village, it was not really there to protect you from foreign invaders. It was there to protect the Lord from you, to remind you every single day who had power. Those massive stone walls, those towers, those armed men, that was all to keep order, to keep you in your place. Now let me address something you might be thinking. Why did people accept this? Why didn't they just rebel? Well, first of all, some did. We will get to that in later parts of our story. But mostly, they did not rebel for the same reason people today do not rebel against systems they know are unfair. Because they did not see an alternative. This was the only world they knew. Their parents had lived this way. Their grandparents, everyone around them. The church told them this was God's plan, that society was divided into 3 orders, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. You were born into your order, and questioning it was not just illegal, it was sinful. Plus, and this is crucial, the lords did provide something. Protection was real. The Middle Ages were violent. Bandits, raiders, small-scale wars between nobles, these were constant threats. If your village was attacked, you could flee to the castle. The bailey, the outer courtyard, could hold quite a few people in an emergency. So there was a transaction happening. It was a terrible deal for the peasants, but it was not quite slavery. It was more like, well, protection money. You pay, you work, you obey, and we do not hurt you, and maybe we keep others from hurting you. The psychological weight of this system is hard to overstate. You are born knowing your place. You grow up seeing the castle. You learn to bow when the lord or his steward rides by. You watch your father work himself to exhaustion and die young, probably in his 40s if he was lucky. And you know that is your future too. There is no social mobility. A peasant's child is a peasant. A lord's child is a lord. This is the natural order of things. Except, here is the fascinating part. Even this iron system had cracks, small ones, hidden ones. But they were there. Some peasants were free, not many, maybe 10 or 15%, but they existed. Free peasants owed taxes, but not labour service. They could leave if they wanted. They could negotiate. Their existence proved the system was not actually natural or inevitable. It was constructed, and what is constructed can be deconstructed. Also, peasants had their own communities. The manor court handled disputes between villagers, and often these were decided by a jury of local people, not by the lord. Peasants had customs, traditions, ways of doing things that even lords had to respect because they were embedded in the fabric of daily life. There was a saying, "Custom is before law." Even the nobility had to acknowledge certain traditional rights. And here is something that might surprise you. Peasants had leisure time. Not a lot. But the church calendar included numerous feast days, maybe 60 or 70 days a year, when no work was supposed to be done. On those days there might be festivals, games, drinking, dancing. These moments of community and joy were jealously guarded. When lords tried to make people work on feast days, there could be serious resistance. So life was not unrelenting misery every single moment. It was hard, brutally hard, but humans are resilient. They found moments of happiness. They fell in love. They joked and sang. They complained about the weather and gossiped about their neighbours. They were people, living lives that were not so different, emotionally, from ours, even if the material conditions were radically worse. But, and this is a big but, the system was fragile. It depended on everything staying in balance. It needed a growing population to keep labour cheap and plentiful. It needed decent harvests most years. It needed enough peace that the lords could maintain their authority without constantly fighting wars. It needed peasants to accept their place, or at least not have better options. By the early 1400s, cracks were already showing. The population had been growing for 2 centuries, and there was not much good land left to bring into cultivation. Famines were becoming more frequent. Between 1315 and 1322, there was a massive famine across Europe. Crops failed year after year. People starved by the thousands. Desperate people started eating grass, bark, even reports of cannibalism in some areas. This weakened everyone, and a weakened population is vulnerable. Vulnerable to disease, vulnerable to unrest, vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic collapse that would come with the Black Death. But we are not there yet in our story. Right now, I want you to hold in your mind this image, a system that seemed permanent, a way of life that had lasted 400 years, castles that had stood for centuries and seemed like they would stand forever, and beneath it all, millions of people working themselves to exhaustion, paying and paying and paying, living lives that were anonymous to history but absolutely essential to making everything else possible. Because here is the truth. Medieval civilization did not run on the nobility. It ran on peasants. Every stone in every cathedral was quarried, transported and set by people we do not remember. Every suit of armour was made from metal mined and smelted by peasants. Every feast in every castle was made possible by peasants in fields, growing food they would never taste. 90% of Europe was peasants. 90%. And yet when we tell the story of the Middle Ages, we talk about kings and knights and maybe occasionally mention that there were, also some other people around. It is absurd when you think about it. So now you understand what they stood to lose, but also you understand what they stood to gain. Because when the system started to crack, when labour became scarce, when the impossible started to seem possible, these were people who had been waiting, sometimes without even knowing they were waiting, for a chance. The catastrophes were coming. Oh, they were coming. War, famine and plague. The 4 horsemen, if you want to be dramatic about it, were about to converge in a way that would shatter this world. And when they did, people like William and Margaret in Nottingham, like Agnes and Thomas at Waram, Percy, like thousands and thousands of others whose names we will never know, would have to make choices that their ancestors could never have imagined making. So let's continue. Let's watch as the perfect storm gathers. Let's see how 4 separate catastrophes came together to break what seemed unbreakable. Because understanding how systems fall is just as important as understanding how they function. And the fall that is coming is spectacular, terrible, and ultimately strangely hopeful. Stay with me. We're about to witness the world change. Sometimes in history everything goes wrong at once. Not one disaster, not 2. But 4 separate catastrophes that converge like a perfect storm. And when the dust settles, the world is simply not the same anymore. That is what happened in the 14th century. And honestly, if you had told someone in the year 1300 what was coming, they would not have believed you. It would have sounded too extreme, too apocalyptic, like something out of a nightmare, not reality. But it happened. All of it. And we need to talk about each piece of this disaster because understanding how they fit together is crucial to understanding why the castles fell and why the peasants, for the first time in 4 centuries, had leverage. So let's start with the one that most people forget about, the Great Famine. It is March 1315. Europe has been relatively stable for decades. The population has been growing steadily. New lands have been cleared for farming, towns are expanding. Things are not great for peasants. We just talked about their harsh reality, but they are not getting worse. The system is functioning as designed, and then the weather changes. It starts to rain, and it does not stop. I am not talking about a few rainy days. I am talking about months of relentless cold rain. Throughout 1315, across England, France, Germany, the Low Countries, the rain just keeps coming. Fields turn into swamps. Seeds rot before they can germinate. The wheat that does manage to grow gets battered down by storms. Harvest time comes, and there is almost nothing to harvest. One bad harvest is manageable. You eat less. You dip into reserves. You tighten your belt and hope next year is better. But 1316 brings more rain. The harvest fails again, and then 1317, 3 years of failed crops. Can you imagine? 3 years of watching your children grow thinner, knowing you have nothing to give them. 3 years of eating grass and bark and things you would never normally consider food. The death toll from the Great Famine is estimated between 5 and 12% of Europe's population. That is millions of people. Millions. Entire villages were wiped out. In Flanders, which is modern-day Belgium and parts of France and the Netherlands, chroniclers reported seeing people so desperate they were eating their own children. Now, those reports are probably exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers loved a dramatic story. But the fact that anyone thought such stories were plausible tells you how bad things got. And here is what this did to the system. It weakened everyone. The peasants were literally starving. The lords were struggling because their income depended on the peasants producing food, and there was no food. The whole economic structure started to crack. People started to question whether this was really God's plan, or whether something had gone terribly wrong. The famine finally ended in 1322, but Europe never fully recovered before the next disaster hit. The population was weakened. Disease was more common. Trust in the old order was shaken. The stage was set. Now, add to this a war. Not just any war. The 100 Years' War, which despite the name actually lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453. This was England versus France, and it was brutal. You might be thinking, What do I care about kings fighting over territory? Well, you should care, because guess who did most of the dying? Guess whose fields got trampled by armies? Guess who paid the taxes to fund this endless conflict? Yeah, the peasants. Medieval warfare was not like modern warfare. Armies did not just fight each other and leave civilians alone. They burned crops, they stole livestock, they destroyed villages. This was intentional. It was a tactic called chevauchée, basically scorched earth policy. If you could not control a territory, you made sure it was worthless to your enemy. And the people who suffered most were the ones who could not flee, the ones tied to their land. The 100 Years' War also did something else. It bankrupted the nobility. War is expensive, incredibly expensive. You need to pay soldiers, buy equipment, maintain supply lines. English and French kings levied tax after tax after tax. And where did these taxes come from? You guessed it, the already struggling peasants. But here is where it gets interesting for our story. The 100 Years' War also changed military technology in ways that would make castles obsolete. Before this war, the armoured knight on horseback was the ultimate weapon. If you had a castle and a company of knights, you were nearly invincible. But during this war, the English developed a devastating weapon, the longbow. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen absolutely devastated French knights. At Agincourt in 1415, it happened again. These were not supposed to be possible victories. Peasant archers, because that is who the longbowmen were, trained commoners, were killing armoured nobles. The natural order was being inverted, and everyone noticed. And then came gunpowder. Oh, gunpowder! This changed everything. The Chinese had invented gunpowder centuries earlier, but Europeans started using it for weapons in the early 1400s. At first, the cannons were crude, unreliable, as dangerous to the people firing them as to the enemy. But they improved, rapidly. Let me tell you about Constantinople. This is 1453, and the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, is down to basically one city. Constantinople has walls that have protected it for over 1,000 years. Walls that are legendary. Triple walls in some places up to 40 feet thick. These walls had stopped countless sieges, but the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II has a plan. He hires a Hungarian engineer named Urban, yes, that was his actual name, to build the biggest cannon anyone had ever seen. This thing was 27 feet long and could fire stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. They called it the Dardanelles gun, and it was an absolute monster. For 57 days this cannon and others like it bombarded Constantinople's walls. And those walls that had stood for a millennium, they crumbled. They just crumbled. Stone that had seemed eternal, shattered by gunpowder and mathematics. Constantinople fell on May 29th, 1453, and everyone in Europe understood. The age of the castle was over. If the greatest walls in the world could not stop cannons, what chance did your local lord's castle have? None. The answer is none. Suddenly all those massive stone fortresses that had been built over centuries, that had cost fortunes, that had seemed like permanent fixtures of the landscape, they were expensive liabilities. They could not protect you anymore, and they cost too much to maintain. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the big one, the catastrophe that dwarfed all the others, the event that killed more people than anything before or since in European history, the Black Death. It started in Asia, probably around 1338. The plague, caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, though they did not know that at the time, travelled along trade routes. Rats carried infected fleas. The fleas bit humans. And then people started dying. It reached the Black Sea in 1346. From there, it jumped to Italian trading ships. By October 1347, it was in Sicily. By January 1348, it was in France. By June 1348, it reached England. And then it just spread like wildfire. Faster than anyone could run from it. The symptoms were horrifying. Remember, we talked about these earlier. The buboes, the swellings, the blackening skin, the fever. But let me give you some more detail because the sheer horror of this disease is important to understand. You would feel fine in the morning. By afternoon, you might have a fever. By evening, you would notice a lump under your arm or in your groin. By the next day, that lump would be the size of an apple, painful, oozing. Some people developed pneumonic plague, coughing up blood. Others developed septicemic plague, where the blood itself was infected. Most people who showed symptoms died within 3 to 5 days. Some died in hours. And here is the truly terrifying part. Nobody knew what caused it. They tried everything. They burned incense to purify the air. They carried flowers to ward off bad smells, thinking the disease came from miasma, bad air. They whipped themselves, thinking God was punishing them for their sins. They blamed the Jews, which led to horrific pogroms across Europe. They tried bloodletting, which only made people weaker and more likely to die. Nothing worked. The plague did not care if you were rich or poor, noble or peasant, pious or sinful. It killed everyone. Well, not quite everyone. We will talk about who survived in the next section. But it killed a staggering percentage of the population. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Europe in 1346 had a population of about 73 million people. By 1353 it was down to maybe 51 million. That is 22 million people dead in 7 years. Some regions lost 30% of their population. Some lost 50%. Some villages lost everyone and simply ceased to exist. Nottingham, that city we talked about earlier, lost 60% of its population in 1349 alone. 60% in 1 year. Imagine your neighbourhood, your workplace, your family. Now imagine 6 out of every 10 people you know dying within 12 months. The psychological trauma alone is almost unimaginable. Here is a quote from a contemporary chronicler, a monk in France. People died as if the whole strength of the town were seized by a sudden death. For there were few who lay in their beds more than 3 days or 2.5 days. Then they were snatched by that savage death. Another chronicler in England wrote, "So great a pestilence had never been seen, heard of, or written about in any age before this." Some said it was the end of the world. It felt like the end of the world. And in a way, it was. The medieval world, the world of feudalism and castles and knights, was ending. Not all at once, but the cracks that had appeared during the famine, that had widened during the war, now split wide open during the plague. Because here is what the Black Death did that the famine did not. It created a labour shortage. The famine killed people, yes, but it killed the weak, the old, the young, the already sick. The Black Death killed everyone, including the strong, healthy workers that the entire feudal system depended on. Suddenly, there were fields with no one to work them, manors with no servants, castles with no soldiers, and the peasants who survived. They looked around and realized something astonishing. They were needed, desperately needed. For the first time in centuries, they had leverage. But I want you to understand something important. These 4 catastrophes, the famine, the war, the plague, the military revolution, they did not just happen by coincidence. They fed into each other. The famine weakened people, making them more susceptible to disease. The war spread disease by moving armies around and disrupting food supplies. The need for weapons to fight the war accelerated the development of gunpowder technology. And the plague killed so many people that labour became valuable, which meant peasants could demand rights, which meant lords needed more military force to control them, which meant more war. It was a vicious cycle, a perfect storm, and the system that had seemed so solid, so permanent, so ordained by God himself, that system could not survive all four hitting at once. Now, you might be wondering, if this was so catastrophic, if so many people died, why did it not just destroy civilization entirely? Why did anything survive? That is a fair question, and the answer is both simple and profound. Humans are incredibly resilient. Even in the darkest times, people adapt. They find ways to keep going. They have children. They plant crops. They rebuild. Life finds a way. But adaptation means change. And the world that rebuilt after the plague was different. It had to be. The old rules did not work anymore. The old power structures were broken. And into that chaos stepped people who had been powerless before, people who suddenly realized they had options. The castles were still standing, at least most of them. The lords were still lords. The church still preached the same sermons about knowing your place. But something fundamental had shifted. The balance of power had changed. And once power shifts, it is very hard to shift it back. So here we are, standing in the ruins of the old world, bodies piled in churchyards, villages abandoned, castles that cannot protect anyone, lords who cannot enforce their will. And walking through this devastation are the survivors, the peasants who made it through. And they are asking themselves a question they have never dared to ask before. What if we just said no? That question, that simple, dangerous question, is about to change everything. Because when people who have nothing left to lose realize they have power, history pivots. Revolutions do not start with grand ideas. They start with exhausted people who simply cannot take it anymore. The four horsemen have ridden. The perfect storm has hit. The old world is broken. And now we need to see what happens when the survivors start to rebuild. Because what they build will not look like what came before. It cannot. Too much has changed. Too many people have died. And the ones who remain have learned something the lords hoped they would never learn. That the system only works if they cooperate. And cooperation can be withdrawn. So let's step forward into the immediate aftermath. Let's watch what happens when half your neighbours are dead, when the fields are empty, when the Lord comes down from his castle to demand the usual services and finds there is no one left to provide them. Let's see the moment when everything the peasants have known breaks down and they have to decide, do we try to rebuild the old world, or do we dare to imagine something new? Silence. That is what you notice first. The absence of sound. If you could walk through an English village in 1350, a year after the plague swept through, the first thing that would strike you would not be the smell of death, though that was there, or the abandoned houses, though those were everywhere. It would be the silence, no children playing, no chickens clucking, no voices calling to each other across the lanes, just wind through empty doorways and the slow collapse of buildings that no one was left to maintain. This is what the die-off actually felt like. Not statistics, not percentages, but silence where there used to be life. Let me take you back to Waram, Percy. We visited this village earlier, in 1349, at the moment when Thomas refused the steward. But what happened in the months and years after? How did a living community become, eventually, a ghost village? Because Waram, Percy did not just disappear overnight. Its death was slow, and in that slowness we can see exactly how the plague transformed everything. In 1348, before the plague arrived, Waram Percy had about 40 households, maybe 200 people total if you count everyone: men, women, children, the elderly. By the end of 1349, after the plague moved through like a scythe through wheat, maybe 70 or 80 people remained. Think about that. 3/4 of everyone you knew gone in a matter of months. But here is what makes this so devastating. It was not random. The plague killed families, entire families, because if one person in your tiny cramped house got sick, everyone else was exposed. You shared beds, you shared food, you breathed the same air. So when the plague came to a household, it often took everyone. Father, mother, children. Whole bloodlines just ended. Now imagine you are one of the survivors. Let us say you are a woman named Emma. You are 30 years old, which makes you genuinely old by medieval standards. Your husband died. 2 of your 3 children died. Your parents, your sister, most of your neighbours, dead. You're alive. Your eldest son is alive, and that is it. That is what you have left. You wake up in the morning and you look out at the village and you see empty houses. The thatch on the roofs is already starting to rot because no one is there to maintain it. The gardens are overgrown. The animals that belong to dead families are wandering loose, or dead themselves from neglect. The church where you worshipped your whole life held 40 families before. Now maybe 10 families come to Mass, and they spread out across the pews, separated by empty space where people used to sit. The churchyard is full, so full that they had to dig mass graves because there was no time to bury everyone properly, no space for individual plots. Father Edmund, the priest, died early in the plague. The new priest, if there even is one, is probably some young man rushed through his training because so many clergy died that the church was desperate for replacements. And here is what happens to the land. Remember, medieval agriculture was organized in strips. Your family had strips scattered across 3 or 4 different fields. Your neighbour had strips near yours. This system worked because everyone was there to work their strips, and you helped each other with the big jobs like ploughing and harvesting. But now, half the strips are empty, maybe more than half. You walk through the fields and you can see where the boundaries are, but there is no one working the land. Wheat is growing wild, turning to seed, wasted. Weeds are taking over. The whole agricultural system that took generations to establish is falling apart because there simply are not enough people left to maintain it. And this is where the mathematics gets interesting. Stay with me on this because this is the moment when everything changes. Before the plague, there were too many peasants and not enough land. Lords could be picky. If you complained about your obligations, there were 10 other peasants who would take your place. You had no leverage. None. The power dynamic was entirely one-sided. But after the plague, suddenly there is too much land and not enough peasants. The equation has flipped. The lord still has all this land, but land by itself is worthless. Land only produces value if someone works it, and there is nobody to work it. So the lord, let us call him Sir Robert of Waram, has a problem. His income has dropped by more than half because most of his peasants are dead. His own expenses have not dropped. He still has to maintain the castle, pay his soldiers, feed his household. He is probably in debt. Many lords were deeply in debt even before the plague, and now their situation is desperate. Sir Robert sends his steward down to the village. The steward, let us call him John, a survivor himself, probably traumatized by everything he has seen, calls the remaining peasants together. He announces that everyone must continue their obligations. Week work will continue. Rents will continue. Everything will be as it was before. And this is where it gets fascinating. Do you know what the peasants said? Some of them said no, not in a dramatic revolutionary way, just no. I cannot work 3 days a week for you, they said. There are not enough of us. If I work 3 days for you, my own family will starve because I cannot work my own land. Other peasants simply left. They packed up what little they had and walked to the next manor, or the next village, or the nearest town. Because suddenly, you could do that. Yes, legally you were still bound to the land. But who was going to enforce that law? The lord did not have enough men-at-arms to chase down fleeing peasants. He needed every person he could get to work the land he had. And here is the really interesting part. Other lords were recruiting, actively recruiting. Come to my manor, they would say, and I will give you better terms, lower rent, fewer days of week work, maybe even cash wages. They were competing for labour. Competing. This had never happened before in living memory, not in generations, maybe not ever. So let me give you some actual numbers, because this is where we can really see the shift. Before the plague, a skilled agricultural worker, someone who could plough, someone who knew how to manage livestock, might earn 2 pence a day during harvest season. After the plague, by 1350, that same worker could demand 4 pence, 5 pence, even 6 pence if you were really skilled and knew how to negotiate. Wages doubled. In some places they tripled. The cost of labour went up so dramatically that the entire economic structure began to crack. Because remember, the feudal system was not based on wages. It was based on obligations. You owed labour, not because you were paid for it, but because you were bound to the land. But when your labour became valuable enough that people would pay you cash for it, the old system started to look really, really stupid. Why would you work 3 days a week for free when the next manor over would pay you actual money? Why would you stay bound to land that could barely support you when you could move to a town and work as a labourer, a craftsman, and be free? The lords panicked. They absolutely panicked. And their panic led to one of the most desperate, short-sighted laws in English history. The Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, just 2 years after the plague ended. This law tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It made it illegal to pay workers more than they earned in 1346. It made it illegal to refuse work at those old wages. It made it illegal to leave your manor to seek better terms elsewhere. Basically, Parliament, which was made up of lords and wealthy landowners, tried to legislate away the labour shortage. They tried to pretend the plague had not changed anything. Can you imagine? Half the country is dead, the survivors have leverage for the first time in their lives, and the government response is, actually, we're going to pretend none of this happened, and you have to work for the same terrible terms as before. It did not work. Of course it did not work. How could it? You cannot legislate away economic reality. The Statute of Labourers was widely ignored. Oh, there were prosecutions. Court records show thousands of cases of people being fined for demanding higher wages or leaving their manors. But the law could not stop the fundamental shift in power, because here is what the lords could not accept. They needed the peasants more than the peasants needed them. That is the core of it. For centuries the lords had provided protection and order, and the peasants had provided labour and obedience. But after the plague, protection meant less. Order meant less. There were fewer bandits because there were fewer people. There were fewer wars because armies were smaller. The castles that had been essential fortresses were becoming expensive relics. But labour? Labour meant everything. Without labour, fields went fallow. Without labour, manor houses fell into disrepair. Without labour, lords went bankrupt. The whole system was built on peasant labour and suddenly peasant labour was scarce and valuable. Now, here is a really important point, and it is where people often get the story wrong. The plague did not automatically free the peasants. It did not instantly end feudalism. That is too simple. What the plague did was create conditions where freedom became possible. It gave peasants leverage, but they still had to fight for every inch of freedom they gained. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In many villages, including parts of Waram, Percy, some peasants negotiated better terms. They agreed to pay cash rent instead of labour service. They bought their freedom, essentially, with money they could now earn because wages were higher. This was a massive change, but it was not given to them. They had to negotiate for it. They had to push back against centuries of tradition and law. Other peasants were not so lucky. Some lords doubled down. They used force, intimidation, legal pressure. They took peasants to manor courts and fined them for violations they would have ignored before the plague. They tried to hold the line, and this brings us to a really dark comparison. What happened in Western Europe, England, France, the Low Countries, was not the only possible outcome. In Eastern Europe, the plague led to a completely different result. Let me tell you about Russia, Poland, and Hungary, because this is important. These regions also lost huge numbers of people to the plague. The labour shortage was just as severe, but the lords there were more unified, more organised, and more willing to use overwhelming force. Instead of peasants gaining freedom, they lost what little freedom they had. This period from the 1500s onward is called the Second Serfdom. Peasants in Russia, Poland, Hungary were reduced to conditions that were arguably worse than before the plague. They became virtually enslaved, bound not just to the land but to the lord in a way that was more like property than service. Russian serfdom, this brutal system, lasted until 1861. 1861! That is well into the age of railroads and photography. Why the difference? Why did Western peasants gain freedom while Eastern peasants lost it? Historians debate this, but several factors seem crucial. Western European monarchs were stronger and more centralized. They played lords and peasants off against each other, preventing the nobility from having total control. Western Europe also had more towns and cities where peasants could flee, which gave them options. And Western European peasants, perhaps crucially, were more willing to organize and resist. They rioted. They revolted. They made it clear that they would not accept a return to the old system without a fight. Eastern European lords, by contrast, were more united, the monarchs were weaker, and there were fewer urban refuges. So when the lords decided to crack down, they succeeded. Freedom is not inevitable. It has to be fought for, constantly, or it can be taken away. Back in Waram, Percy, Emma, our survivor, is making decisions. She cannot work all the strips of land her family used to work. There are just not enough people. So some strips go back to grassland. She negotiates to pay part of her rent in cash, which she earns by working for wages during harvest at neighbouring manors. Her son learns a trade, maybe blacksmithing, because specialists are desperately needed and can command good wages. The village is smaller now, quieter. Some houses are literally falling down. The manor house is less grand because Sir Robert cannot afford to maintain it. The church holds services, but they are sparsely attended. The community that was here is fractured, traumatized, fundamentally changed. And this is happening everywhere. Across England, across France, across Europe. Villages are shrinking or disappearing entirely. Ghost villages are appearing in the landscape. Places where people lived for centuries suddenly abandoned. The earthworks, the foundations, the field patterns remain, slowly being reclaimed by nature. In England alone, of the 1,500 castles built after the Norman conquest of 1066, half were already abandoned by 1300, and after the plague, that number kept climbing. By 1500, most castles were either ruins or had been converted into something else, manor houses, essentially country estates without the military purpose. Because remember what we talked about in the last section, cannons were making castles obsolete anyway. The plague accelerated this process. Lords could not afford to maintain massive fortifications when their income had been cut in half and labour costs had doubled. So they let them decay, or they converted them, or they simply moved out and built something cheaper and more comfortable. The landscape of Europe was transforming. The castles that had dominated the countryside, that had been symbols of feudal power for 300 years, were falling silent, some literally falling down. And the peasants who had built them, who had supplied them, who had lived in their shadow, those peasants were walking away, finding new opportunities, negotiating new terms, imagining new possibilities. But this did not happen peacefully. Oh no, the lords did not just accept their loss of power. The peasants did not just wait patiently for freedom to be granted. What came next was conflict. Violent, messy, often tragic conflict. Revolts that were crushed. Negotiations that turned bloody. A long, grinding struggle over who would control the future. And at the centre of that struggle is a story that almost everyone has forgotten, but that changed the course of history. A story of a peasant girl, a refused tax, and a march on London that nearly toppled the English crown. A moment when everything we have talked about, the labour shortage, the leverage, the anger, the hope, all came together in one explosive confrontation. That story, that incredible, tragic, inspiring story is where we're going next. So stay with me, because what you're about to hear is one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval history, and it involves a man named Wat Tyler, a priest named John Ball, and a question that still echoes today. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? There are moments in history that begin with something absurdly small. A tax collector knocking on the wrong door, a peasant who has simply had enough. One word, just one word, that changes everything. May 30th, 1381, in a small town called Brentwood in Essex, England, was one of those moments. And the word was no. Let me set the scene for you, because context matters here. It is 32 years after the Black Death. The survivors have been rebuilding, negotiating, pushing boundaries. Wages are still higher than before the plague. Peasants have been leaving manors, seeking better terms. The old system is cracking, but it has not broken. The lords are frustrated. The king is desperate for money. And into this powder keg, someone decides to light a match. That match is a new tax. Not just any tax. A poll tax. Poll here means head. Literally a tax on every head, every person over the age of 15. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone pays the same amount, which, if you think about it for even 2 seconds, is spectacularly unfair. A wealthy merchant paying the same as a peasant scraping by. That is either breathtaking stupidity or deliberate cruelty. Probably both. This is the third poll tax in 4 years. The first was 3 groats per person in 1377. The second was higher. And now, in 1381, King Richard II and his advisors, the king is only 14 years old at this point, so real power is held by his uncle John of Gaunt and the Royal Council. They decide to levy an even higher tax, 12 pence per person. That might not sound like much, but remember, These are peasants who maybe earn a few pence a day when they can find work. This tax could represent a week's income or more for an entire family. And here is the thing. Peasants are already paying rent to their lords. They are paying tithes to the church. They are barely surviving. And now the king wants another 12 pence from everyone? For what? To fund a war in France that has nothing to do with them? To pay for a royal court that lives in luxury while they eat pottage and stale bread? The resentment has been building for years. Not just about the taxes, though, that is the immediate spark, but about everything. About the statute of labourers trying to keep their wages low. About lords trying to reimpose obligations that peasants thought they had escaped. About a system that tells them they are naturally inferior, that they should accept their place, that questioning the order of things is a sin against God himself. And then John Bampton arrives in Brentwood. Bampton is a royal tax collector. It is not an enviable job, but someone has to do it, and Bampton is probably just trying to fulfill his duty. He arrives in Brentwood and starts demanding payment. He is checking records, interrogating people, making sure everyone has paid their 12 pence. He's particularly focused on people who might have evaded the earlier poll taxes, and then he encounters Thomas Baker. We do not know much about Thomas Baker. No portrait survives, no detailed records, but we know he was from Fobbing, a village near Brentwood. We know he was a peasant, and we know that when Bampton demanded payment, claiming that Baker and others had not paid the previous poll tax, Baker said something that would echo through history. He said they had already paid. He said he had proof. And when Bampton insisted and threatened, Baker refused. Just refused. And the other villagers backed him up. Now, you have to understand, refusing a royal official was not just risky. It was essentially treason. But something in the air had changed. These were people who had survived the plague, who had buried their children, who had negotiated for higher wages and won, who had walked away from manors and found freedom. They were not the same peasants who would have meekly accepted whatever the authorities demanded 30 years earlier. Bampton tried to arrest Baker, and the villagers chased Bampton out of town. They did not kill him. Not yet, the violence would come later, but they made it clear he was not welcome. Word spread rapidly. Other villages heard what happened in Brentwood, and they started to gather. This is June now, early June 1381. Groups of peasants from Essex and Kent are meeting, organising. They are not just angry about the poll tax anymore. They are angry about everything. The statute of labourers, the corrupt officials, the wealthy church, the young king surrounded by greedy advisers, the whole rotten system, and they need a leader. Several men emerge, but two in particular will define this revolt. Wat Tyler and John Ball. Wat Tyler, his name might be a nickname, Wat being short for Walter, and Tyler suggesting he was a tilemaker or roofer, becomes the military leader. He's from Kent, probably from Maidstone. Chronicles describe him as a former soldier, someone who knew how to organise men, how to think tactically. He is charismatic, fierce, unafraid. Exactly the kind of man you want leading a rebellion. John Ball is different. He is a priest, a radical priest who has been preaching against inequality for years. The church has already imprisoned him multiple times for his inflammatory sermons. He is currently locked up in Maidstone Castle for heresy. His message is simple but revolutionary. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Think about that question. When Adam dug in the garden and Eve spun thread, at the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, who was the noble? Who was the peasant? The answer is no one. Everyone was equal, which means the entire feudal hierarchy, the whole system of nobles and peasants, is artificial, man-made, and what man makes, man can unmake. This is explosive stuff. This is questioning the very foundation of medieval society. And John Ball has been saying this for years, getting arrested for it, and never shutting up. On June 7th, 1381, the rebels march into Maidstone. They free John Ball from his prison cell. They declare Wat Tyler their leader, and they attack Rochester Castle, burning government tax records, burning the records. This is not just about refusing to pay. This is about erasing the very documents that prove what you owe. It is symbolic and practical at once. By June 13th, the revolt has grown beyond anyone's imagination. Peasants from Essex and Kent are converging on London. Not hundreds, thousands. Some estimates say as many as 60,000 people, though that might be exaggerated, but certainly tens of thousands. An army of peasants, many armed with farm tools, some with bows, a few with actual weapons. They are marching on the capital of England. Can you imagine what this looked like? What it felt like? If you were a peasant who had spent your whole life being told you were nothing, and suddenly you are part of an army of your peers, marching to demand justice from the king himself. The energy must have been electric. Terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. For the first time in your life you are not powerless. They reach London on June 13th. King Richard II, remember he is 14 years old, is in the Tower of London with his advisors, probably terrified. The city gates are supposed to be closed, locked, defended. But here is what happened. Some Londoners sympathised with the rebels. They opened the gates, the rebels flooded into the city, and then things got ugly. Because revolutions, even justified ones, often involve violence. The rebels did not just march peacefully. They attacked the Savoy Palace, the magnificent home of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle, who was widely hated. They burned it to the ground, completely destroyed it. They freed prisoners from jails. They hunted down royal officials, tax collectors, lawyers. Several were killed, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also Lord Chancellor, essentially the Prime Minister. They dragged him out of the Tower of London and beheaded him. This was not a peaceful protest. This was a revolution, messy and violent and driven by decades of accumulated rage. The rebels had demands, but they also wanted revenge. On June 14th, King Richard agreed to meet them. Not in the city, too dangerous, but at Mile End, outside the walls. This is an extraordinary moment. A 14-year-old king facing an army of angry peasants. He could have refused. He could have tried to fight them. Instead, he met with them. The peasants presented their demands. They wanted the abolition of serfdom, complete abolition. They wanted all men to be free. They wanted rent to be set at 4 pence per acre, a reasonable rate. They wanted pardons for all rebels. They wanted punishment for traitors and corrupt officials, and Richard agreed. He said yes. He promised to abolish serfdom. He promised they could all go home as free men. He issued charters, actual written documents, granting freedom. The rebels were jubilant. They had won. Against all odds, they had forced the king to grant their demands. Except it was not that simple. Because the next day, June 15th, there was another meeting at Smithfield, a field outside London. This one was smaller, just the leaders meeting with the king. Wat Tyler rode forward to speak with Richard. Accounts of what happened next vary, but here is what seems to have occurred. Wat Tyler made additional demands. He wanted church lands redistributed to the common people. He wanted equality, genuine equality, not just the end of serfdom, but the end of the entire social hierarchy. This was radical even by the standards of the revolt. And during the negotiations, something went wrong. Some accounts say Wat Tyler was rude, that he did not show proper respect to the king. Others say he demanded water, drank it in an insulting manner. Still others say one of the king's men started the confrontation. What we know for certain is that William Walworth, the mayor of London, stabbed Wat Tyler. Just stabbed him, right there, in front of everyone. Wat Tyler fell from his horse. He was carried away, dying. The rebel army watching this happen was about to attack. Thousands of armed peasants against the king's small retinue. It could have been a massacre. It could have been the end of the English monarchy right there. And then 14-year-old Richard II did something incredibly brave, or incredibly stupid, depending on how you look at it. He rode forward, alone, toward the rebel army, and he shouted, "I am your captain! Follow me!" He promised again that their demands would be met. He said Wat Tyler was a traitor, that they should trust him, Richard, their king. And somehow, incredibly, it worked. The rebels followed him away from the city. The moment of maximum danger passed. Wat Tyler died of his wounds, and once the rebel army dispersed, once the peasants went back to their villages believing they had won, the king and his council did what you probably expect they did. They reneged on everything, every promise, every charter. Richard declared that the charters granted under duress were invalid. The rebels were hunted down. The leaders who could be identified were arrested and executed. John Ball was captured in Coventry, tried and hung, drawn and quartered, the most brutal execution medieval England had. His last words reportedly were still defiant, still proclaiming that all men should be equal. The revolt was crushed. Within weeks, it was over. The rebel leaders were dead. The charters were revoked. Serfdom was not abolished. Richard supposedly said to a delegation of peasants who came asking about the promises, "Villains you were, and villains you shall remain." So the revolt failed, right? They lost. They achieved nothing. That is what it looks like on the surface. The peasants tried to overthrow the system, and the system won. Except, not really. Because here is the thing about failed revolutions. Sometimes losing is just winning slowly. Yes, the immediate demands were not met. Yes, serfdom was not officially abolished. Yes, the leaders were executed. But the revolt terrified the nobility. Absolutely terrified them. They realized that if pushed too far, the peasants would rise up, and next time they might succeed. So things changed. Quietly, gradually, but they changed. The poll tax was never levied again. Not once. Lords became more careful about trying to reimpose old obligations. The Statute of Labourers was still on the books, but enforcement became patchwork at best. Wages continued to rise, peasants continued to negotiate better terms, and within a century serfdom in England had essentially died out. Not through legislation, not through royal decree, but through 1,000 individual negotiations, 1,000 peasants walking away, 1,000 lords deciding it was easier to pay wages than to fight to preserve a dying system. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 did not achieve its goals, but it showed what was possible. It showed that ordinary people, when pushed to their absolute limit, could organise, could march on the capital, could force the king himself to negotiate. That is powerful. That is a memory that does not fade. And the question John Ball asked, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? That question echoed through the centuries. The levellers in the 1600s invoked it. Socialists in the 1800s invoked it. Modern labour movements invoke it. The idea that hierarchy is artificial, that equality is the natural state, that systems can be changed, that idea, once planted, is very hard to kill. Was it worth it? For Wat Tyler, dying of stab wounds in a London street. For John Ball, executed as a traitor. For the thousands of peasants who risked everything. I think they would say yes, because they proved something. They proved that power is not permanent, that the weak, when united, are not weak, that saying no is possible, even when every force in society tells you it is not. The castles were still standing in 1381. The lords still controlled the land. The system looked intact. But the cracks we talked about earlier, they had just become chasms, and through those chasms change was pouring in. Unstoppable change. The kind of change that happens not in dramatic moments but in 1,000 small decisions made by ordinary people who have decided they deserve better. So what happened next? How did this change actually play out? Because the revolt was crushed, but the leverage peasants had gained from the labour shortage remained. The economics had not changed, and economics in the long run is often more powerful than violence or law. So let's follow the money. Let's watch as peasants, one by one, family by family, village by village, use their newfound leverage to negotiate freedom. Not through revolution this time, but through the slow, grinding, incredibly effective power of economic necessity. Because sometimes the most radical change happens not with a bang, but with a quiet, I want to be paid. Money talks. It always has. And in the decades after the peasants' revolt was crushed, money started saying things that absolutely horrified the nobility. Things like, your peasant is worth more than you are. Things like, the old rules do not apply anymore. Things like, pay up or we walk. This is where the real revolution happened. Not in the streets of London with Wat Tyler, not in dramatic confrontations with kings, but in thousands of quiet negotiations in manor houses across Europe, where peasants sat across from lords and said something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. These are my terms. Let me show you how this worked, because the economics are fascinating, and I mean truly fascinating in a way that changes how you think about power. Imagine you are a lord in 1400. Let us say you are Lord Edmund of a manor in Oxfordshire in central England. You inherited this estate from your father. It has been in your family for 6 generations. You have a stone manor house, not quite a castle, but a solid, respectable residence. You have maybe 500 acres of good farmland. You have woods for hunting. You have a mill, a church, some cottages for your peasants. On paper, you are wealthy. In reality, you are struggling. Why? Because you cannot find workers. It is 50 years after the plague now, and the population has not recovered. In fact, it might have declined further due to smaller recurring outbreaks of disease. You have all this land, but land does not plant itself. Land does not harvest itself. You need people, desperately. Before the plague, you had 20 peasant families working your land. They owed you 3 days of week work. During harvest, they owed you extra days. They paid rent in crops. The system worked because they had no other options. Now, you have maybe 12 families left, and half of them are talking about leaving. Last week, one of your villains, a man named Robert, whose family has been on your land for 4 generations, came to see you. He did not bow as deeply as his grandfather would have. He looked you in the eye, and he said, "My lord, I can no longer provide 3 days of week work. I have my own fields to tend. I propose to pay you a cash rent instead, 6 shillings per year for my holding. 6 shillings, that is 72 pence. Before the plague, you would have laughed at this. You would have reminded Robert that he was bound to the land, that his obligations were fixed by custom and law, that his proposal was not just rejected but offensive. You might have threatened him with the manor court. But now, you do the math. Robert is a good worker, strong, experienced, knows the land. If he leaves, who replaces him? The manor next to yours is offering cash wages and reduced obligations. The town 15 miles away is always looking for labourers. Robert has options, so you negotiate. You do not accept 6 shillings, that is too low. But you agree to 7 shillings and only 1 day of week work during harvest. Robert is now paying rent instead of labour. This is a massive shift. Because once you accept cash rent, you have fundamentally changed the relationship. He is now a tenant, not a serf. The distinction might seem small, but it is everything. And you, Lord Edmund, have just taken the first step toward becoming a landlord in the modern sense, rather than a feudal lord. You might not realize it yet, but the old world is slipping away. Now multiply this scene by thousands, tens of thousands, across England, across France, across the Low Countries. Peasants are negotiating. Some are successful, some are not. But the trend is clear. Labour is expensive, land is cheap, and the people who own the labour have leverage. Let me give you some real numbers, because this is where it gets wild. In 1346, before the plague, a skilled ploughman might earn 2 pence per day during harvest season if he was working for wages at all. Most were not. They were working their obligations. But by 1350, just after the plague, that same ploughman could demand 4 to 5 pence. By 1370, 6 pence. By 1400, some skilled agricultural workers were earning 8 pence per day. Do you see what happened there? Wages quadrupled in 50 years. Quadrupled. Imagine if minimum wage did that. Imagine if the minimum wage in 1974 was $2 per hour, and by 2024 it was $8. Wait, bad example, because that actually would have been great and did not happen. Let me try again. Imagine if your parents earned $30,000 per year in 1980, and you, doing the same job, earned $120,000 per year now. That is the scale of the wage increase we're talking about. It was revolutionary. It completely restructured the economy. But here is the thing. This was not just about wages for day labourers. This was about the death of unfree labour. Because once some peasants are being paid cash, everyone starts asking, why am I working for free? Why am I providing week work when that person over there is being paid? The old system depended on everyone accepting their obligations. It depended on custom, on tradition, on the idea that this is just how things are. But once you see an alternative, once you see someone negotiating successfully, the whole facade crumbles. Let me tell you about a place where this happened early and completely: Holland. Parts of the Low Countries, especially Holland and Flanders, had already been moving toward cash rents before the plague. After the plague, this accelerated dramatically. By 1400, the majority of peasants in Holland were paying cash rent and were legally free. Not serfs, not villains, free tenants. And you know what happened? Holland became incredibly prosperous. Because when peasants are free to move, to work where wages are highest, to invest in improving their own land because they know they will benefit from it, the whole economy grows, innovation happens, efficiency increases. Holland in the 1500s and 1600s would become one of the wealthiest regions in Europe. Part of that success traces back to this early transition away from serfdom. Compare that to regions where lords successfully resisted these changes. Parts of northern England, Scotland, areas where the lords were more united and more willing to use force to maintain the old system. These regions stayed poorer, longer. The correlation is striking. Where peasants gained freedom, economies grew. Where serfdom persisted, Economies stagnated. But let us get back to Lord Edmund and his negotiation with Robert, because this is not just an economic transaction. This is the end of a worldview. For centuries, the relationship between lord and peasant was personal. It was about loyalty and obligation and mutual duties. Lords were supposed to protect their peasants. Peasants were supposed to serve their lords. It was hierarchical, yes, and exploitative, absolutely, but it had a certain, let us call it feudal logic. Cash rent destroys that logic. Once Robert is paying money, the relationship becomes transactional. He does not owe loyalty. He owes rent. If he can find a better deal elsewhere, why should he stay? Lord Edmund does not owe protection in the old sense. He provides land. Robert provides money. It is a business arrangement. This might sound cold, but from the peasant perspective, it was liberating. Because business arrangements can be negotiated. You can shop around. You can leverage competing offers. You have agency in a way you never did when your grandfather's oath bound your entire family to this land forever. And lords hated this. Oh, they hated it. They tried everything to stop it. Let me catalogue their attempts, because some of these are darkly hilarious in hindsight. First, propaganda. Lords and church officials preached constantly about the natural order, about how God ordained that society should have 3 estates: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. About how peasants questioning their place was sinful, about how the plague was punishment for pride and disobedience. Sermons emphasized that everyone should be content with their station, that seeking to rise above your birth was a form of greed. Did this work? Not really. Hard to convince someone to accept poverty for spiritual reasons when they can see the Lord living in luxury. Hard to preach contentment when the priest himself often came from a wealthy family and had never worked a field in his life. Second, law. We talked about the Statute of Labourers in 1351, but that was just the beginning. There were follow-up statutes, manor court cases, attempts to legally bind people to their obligations. Courts would fine people for leaving their manor, for demanding high wages, for refusing customary duties. Thousands of cases. Court records are full of them. Did this work? Partially. Some people were punished, some were deterred, but you cannot arrest everyone. If half your population is violating the law, enforcement becomes impossible, and peasants got clever. They would have their neighbours testify that they had worked for the customary wage, when actually they had been paid more under the table. They would move just far enough away that their old lord could not easily pursue them. They found the loopholes. Third, violence. Some lords used force. They sent men to drag runaway peasants back. They beat people who refused to work. They made examples of troublemakers. This happened. Medieval manor life could be brutal, and lords had the legal right to discipline their peasants. Did this work? Sometimes, but force is expensive. You need men willing to beat their neighbours. You need to enforce compliance constantly, and if you're too brutal, people really do leave. They flee to towns, they join other manors, they disappear. The labour shortage meant peasants had options, and violence could not eliminate those options. So despite all these efforts, the propaganda, the laws, the force, the trend continued. Week work declined, boon work declined, cash rents increased, wages rose, freedom spread, slowly but inexorably. Now here is something really important, and I want to make sure you understand this. This process took a long time, a really long time. People often think of historical change as sudden. The plague hit, everything changed, boom, feudalism is over. But that is not how it happened. From roughly 1350 to 1500, 150 years, the transformation unfolded, generation by generation, negotiation by negotiation. Some families gained freedom early, others remained in servitude for another century. Regional variation was enormous. In some parts of England, serfdom was effectively dead by 1400. In others, it lingered into the 1500s. And remember, in Eastern Europe it got worse instead of better. But the overall direction was clear. The old bonds were dissolving. The castle system that had defined medieval life was becoming obsolete, not just militarily, because of cannons, but economically, because the feudal relationships it represented no longer made sense. Think about what this meant for someone like Robert, our peasant who negotiated cash rent. His grandfather had been bound to the land, unable to leave, obligated to work for the Lord 3 days every week. His father had probably done the same, though maybe with some grumbling and minor negotiations. Robert himself had managed to convert most obligations to cash. And Robert's son? Robert's son might grow up never knowing serfdom at all, might grow up in a world where you rent land or work for wages, where you can move if you want, where you can choose your occupation. Within 3 or 4 generations the world had transformed. Not through revolution, though the peasants' revolt was part of it, but through economics, through the simple fact that when labour is scarce, workers have power, and power, once tasted, is very hard to give up. Does this remind you of anything? Maybe modern debates about wages, about workers' rights, about whether people deserve a living wage. The arguments are eerily similar. Then, peasants should accept customary wages. Demanding more is greedy and disrupts the natural order. Now, workers should accept what the market offers. Demanding more hurts businesses and disrupts the economy. But what history shows us is that when workers have leverage, when unemployment is low, when skills are in demand, when people can credibly threaten to leave, wages rise. That is not ideology. That is economics. And the people who benefit from low wages will always find reasons to argue that wages should stay low. That was true in 1381, and it is true now. The medieval lords genuinely believed they were being reasonable. They thought peasants demanding higher wages were being ungrateful, grasping, immoral. They thought the old system was better for everyone, including the peasants. They were wrong, demonstrably wrong. The regions where peasants gained freedom and higher wages became more prosperous. The regions where lords successfully suppressed wages and maintained servitude stayed poor. This is one of the clearest lessons from this entire period. Freedom is not just morally right, it is economically efficient. When people can negotiate, can move, can seek better opportunities, everyone benefits in the long run. The economy grows, innovation happens, society advances. But getting there required struggle, required people like Robert sitting across from Lord Edmund and saying, "I want better terms," required thousands of Roberts, over decades, pushing and negotiating and sometimes walking away, required the leverage that came from tragedy, the plague that killed so many, but also the courage to use that leverage. And through all of this, the castles were crumbling, literally and figuratively. Lords could not afford to maintain massive fortifications when their incomes had dropped and labour costs had quadrupled. The stone walls required constant upkeep. Roofs leaked, foundations settled. Without the money and the workforce to maintain them, castles fell into disrepair. Some lords moved out entirely, built smaller, more comfortable manor houses. Why live in a cold, draughty castle that costs a fortune to heat when you can build a nice house with actual windows and fireplaces that work properly? The military necessity was gone anyway. Cannons had made the walls obsolete. The castles became expensive symbols of a dying age. And the peasants? The peasants were moving to towns, to better manners, to opportunities their grandparents could never have imagined. The landscape of Europe was shifting. Villages were shrinking or disappearing. Towns were growing. The population was redistributing. And with it, power was redistributing too. This is the revolution that actually succeeded. Not the dramatic one in 1381, though that mattered too. But the slow, grinding economic revolution that transformed Europe over a century and a half. The revolution that happened in account books and rental agreements and wage negotiations. The revolution that nobody planned but that changed everything. So when people ask, when did feudalism end? The answer is complicated. Legally, different dates in different places. Economically, gradually over generations. Culturally, maybe it never fully ended. We still have hierarchies, still have people arguing that some humans are naturally suited to serve others. But the castle system, the world where stone fortresses dominated the landscape and bound peasants to the land, that world ended. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet no's, 1,000 negotiations, 1,000 people walking away towards something better. And now we need to see where they walk to. Because the castles were falling, yes, but something else was rising. Towns were growing, cities were expanding, a whole new world was being built, and the peasants who left the manors were the ones building it. So let's follow them. Let's see what happened when rural peasants became urban workers, when villages emptied and cities swelled, when the medieval world became, slowly but surely, something new. Because that journey, from field to town, from serf to citizen, is where the story of modernity really begins. Walk with me through the ruins. Not metaphorical ruins, actual ruins. Crumbling stone walls, collapsed towers, roofs open to the sky, staircases that lead nowhere because the floor they once connected to rotted away 2 centuries ago. This is what happened to the castles. The mighty fortresses that had dominated Europe for 300 years simply fell apart. And here is the strange thing. Nobody planned it. There was no decree saying dismantle all castles. No army went around systematically destroying them. They just became too expensive, too impractical, too much trouble, and so they were abandoned, left to the wind and the rain, and the slow, patient work of gravity. Let me tell you what it actually costs to keep a castle standing, because I think this will surprise you. You're standing in front of a medium-sized castle in 1420. Let us say it is Goodrich Castle in Herefordshire, England, a real place, still partially standing today. It is built of red sandstone which looks beautiful but is actually a maintenance nightmare. The castle has thick walls, 4 towers, a keep, a gatehouse, a courtyard. It has stood here for over 200 years, and it is slowly, inexorably falling apart. Here is why. Medieval builders did not have concrete. They had lime mortar, basically limestone burned to powder, mixed with water and sand. It works, sort of, but it is nowhere near as strong or durable as modern concrete. Over time, water seeps into the mortar. In winter, that water freezes, ice expands, the mortar cracks, more water gets in. The cycle repeats. Every winter does a little more damage. Also, medieval castles had no damp-proof course. Do you know what that is? In modern buildings, there is a layer of waterproof material near the ground that stops moisture from rising up through the walls. Medieval builders did not have this. So moisture from the ground constantly wicked up into the stone, especially at the base of walls. Over years and decades, this moisture would eat away at the mortar, weaken the foundations, cause subsidence. The lower parts of castle walls were constantly trying to collapse, and then there is the problem of fire. Even stone castles burn. How? Because while the walls are stone, most of the interior structure is wood. The floors are wooden, the roof supports are wooden, the interior partitions are wooden. One stray spark from a fireplace, one knocked over candle, one lightning strike, and suddenly your castle is an inferno. Stone does not burn, but it cracks and weakens when exposed to intense heat. And once the wooden interior is gone, there is often no money to rebuild it. Let me give you a real example. In 1346, a fire destroyed much of Windsor Castle. Windsor, the royal castle, one of the most important fortifications in England, and even with royal resources it took years and a fortune to repair. Most lords did not have royal resources. If their castle burned, it stayed burned. Now add to all of this the simple fact that castles were never designed to be comfortable. They were designed to be defensible. That means small windows, because windows are weak points. That means thick walls, which makes rooms dark and echoey. That means stone floors, freezing cold in winter. That means spiral staircases in towers, difficult to climb, easy to twist your ankle on. That means a central keep with one big hall, where everyone lives together with almost no privacy. Fireplaces helped a little, but medieval fireplaces were incredibly inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney. The rooms were always full of smoke because ventilation was poor. Your eyes would water, your lungs would hurt, your clothes would reek of smoke permanently, and you would still be cold, because heating a castle adequately in winter was essentially impossible unless you were willing to burn through enormous amounts of wood. So by the early 1400s, many lords were looking at their castles and thinking, why am I living in this cold, dark, uncomfortable, incredibly expensive stone box? Especially when the military necessity is gone. Cannons have made the walls useless for defence. The king has centralised enough power that private wars between nobles are less common. The peasants, while restless, are not actually storming castles anymore. And the costs? Oh, the costs. Let me break this down for you, because it is staggering. A castle requires constant maintenance. The roof needs rethatching or replacing every 20 to 30 years. That is hundreds of pounds in medieval money, maybe tens of thousands in today's terms. The mortar needs repointing, going through and replacing crumbling mortar between stones, constantly. That requires skilled masons, expensive. Drains need clearing. Medieval castles had primitive sewage systems that clogged frequently, and let me tell you, unclogging a medieval drain was not pleasant work. Timber needs replacing as it rots. Metal fittings rust and need replacement. Windows, the few there are, need glass or shutters maintained. And you need staff. A castle of any size requires at least a small garrison. Guards, soldiers, watchmen. You need servants to cook, clean, haul water, empty chamber pots. You need grooms for horses, craftspeople for repairs, a chaplain for the chapel, a steward to manage everything. All of these people need to be paid or given room and board, which amounts to the same thing. The expense is relentless. Now remember what we talked about in the last section. After the plague, lords' incomes dropped dramatically while labour costs quadrupled. Many lords were already in debt before the plague. After the plague, some were in financial crisis. They simply could not afford to maintain their castles anymore. So what did they do? Some moved out. They built new manor houses, still substantial, still symbols of status, but smaller, more comfortable, cheaper to maintain. Manor houses could have bigger windows because you did not need to defend them. They could have more rooms, more privacy, better heating. They were houses designed for living, not for siege warfare. Other lords simply let parts of the castle fall into disrepair. Maybe they kept the main hall and the gatehouse maintained, but let the towers crumble, or they abandoned the outer bailey and lived only in the inner keep. Gradually over decades, castles became part ruin, part residence, and some castles were abandoned entirely, left to anyone who wanted to use them, and you know who took them. The peasants, the very people who had built them. Let me tell you something that I find deeply satisfying. In many places, once a castle was abandoned, local people would come and take the stones. Just help themselves. They would pry out dressed stones, stones that had been carefully cut and shaped, and use them to build their own houses. Foundations for cottages, lintels for doorways, garden walls, stone fences. There is something poetic about that, right? For centuries, peasants had built castles that symbolized their oppression. And then, when those castles fell, they literally dismantled them and used the pieces to build their own homes. The physical substance of feudal power became raw material for peasant prosperity. Let me give you a specific example. Goodrich Castle, which we talked about earlier, was inhabited through the 1500s. But by the 1600s it was beginning to fall apart. During the English Civil War in the 1640s it was briefly refortified and used, then severely damaged during a siege. After that it was deliberately partially demolished, called slighting, to make sure it could never be used militarily again. And then local people stripped it for building material. For 2 centuries Goodrich Castle was essentially a quarry. Only in the 1800s did people start to think, maybe we should preserve this as a historical site, or consider Waram, Percy, our village from earlier. The castle there, really more of a fortified manor house, was abandoned in the 1400s as the village shrank. By the 1500s it was a ruin. By the 1600s most of the stone had been carried off. Today you can barely see where it stood. Just earthworks and a few foundation stones. This pattern repeated across Europe. In England alone, of the roughly 1,500 castles built between 1066 and 1300, most were ruins or completely gone by 1600. In France, similar proportions. In Germany, where there had been literally thousands of castles, Germany was extremely fragmented politically. Every minor noble seemed to have a castle. Huge numbers were abandoned. Some became romantic ruins. By the 1700s and 1800s, when aristocrats were building new country estates, ruins were fashionable. A crumbling tower on your property was considered picturesque. It spoke of ancient nobility, of Gothic romance, of history. So some ruins were deliberately preserved or even enhanced, made more ruin-like if that makes sense for aesthetic purposes. But most just decayed. Wind and rain and plant roots slowly pulled them apart. Ivy grew over walls, its roots working into cracks and widening them. Birds nested in towers. Animals denned in old cellars. The forest reclaimed clearings that had been maintained as fields of fire for arrows and siege engines. And here is something I want you to think about: the psychological impact. Imagine you are someone in 1500 and your great-great-grandfather told stories about the castle on the hill, about the mighty lord who lived there, about the soldiers and the banquets and the power, and now you walk past it and it is just broken. Walls tumbled down, rooms open to the sky, owls living where lords once slept. What does that do to your sense of the permanence of power? What does it tell you about the inevitability of the social order? If even mighty castles crumble, maybe the hierarchy they represented is not as eternal as everyone claimed. There is a term historians use for some of these abandoned castles: deserted medieval monuments. Like deserted medieval villages, which we've talked about, but these are specifically fortifications, and there are hundreds of them across Britain alone, sites where castles once stood but nothing remains except earthworks, the mound where a Motte Bailey castle was built, the outline of a bailey where you can still see the depression where the ditch was dug. Some of these are dramatic. In Italy, hilltop fortified villages were sometimes completely abandoned when the population shrank. You can walk through them today. Empty stone buildings, narrow medieval streets, defensive walls still standing but enclosing nothing but silence. They are beautiful and eerie in equal measure. But let me tell you about the strangest fate some castles met: emparkment. This is one of my favourite absurd historical facts, and it shows just how completely the priorities of the nobility had shifted. By the 1600s and 1700s, wealthy nobles were not building castles anymore. They were building country houses, elaborate mansions with formal gardens, decorative fountains, landscaped parks. This was the age of landscape architecture, of creating carefully designed views that looked natural but were actually meticulously planned. And sometimes there was a problem. There was a village in the way of the perfect view, an actual village with actual people living in it, people whose families had been there for centuries, and the noble, who owned the land and had enormous power, would decide, I want this village gone. So the village would be evicted, everyone kicked out, their houses demolished, the church perhaps left standing as a picturesque ruin, but everything else cleared, the land turned into pasture or parkland, all so that Lord Whoever could look out his window and see an uninterrupted pastoral vista, instead of unsightly peasant cottages. This happened multiple times. Historians have documented specific cases. Sheriff Hutton in Yorkshire had a village called East Lilling that was cleared by the Neville family to improve the view from the castle and hall. The villagers were relocated to West Lilling, on the other side of the deer park. Their entire community destroyed for aesthetics. Or Waram, Percy again. One of the reasons it was finally abandoned in the early 1600s, after shrinking slowly for 2 centuries, was that the landowner converted the area to sheep pasture. Sheep farming required fewer workers than arable farming, so the remaining peasants were essentially made redundant. The village was cleared, the land became grazing for sheep. Can you imagine? Your family has lived in a village for 10 generations. Your ancestors built the church, tilled the fields, raised children in these houses, and then someone who probably never does any physical labour himself decides your entire community is less important than his sheep, or his view, and you have to leave. Where do you go? What do you do? Many went to towns, which is where we're heading in our next section, but some became wandering labourers, moving from farm to farm, never settling. Some became squatters on marginal land. Some probably died because poverty in this era was brutal and life without land was precarious. The castles, meanwhile, were transforming. Some became country houses, as we have discussed. Some became prisons. Thick walls and small windows make pretty good jails. Some became storage facilities. Some became nothing at all, just piles of stone slowly sinking into the landscape. And the word castle itself changed meaning. In French, chateau originally meant a fortified castle. By the 1600s, it just meant a large country house. The military connotation faded. Same in English. We started calling large houses castles even when they had no defensive purpose whatsoever. Hearst Castle in California, not a castle. Bolt Castle in New York, not a castle. They are mansions built to look vaguely castle-like, because that aesthetic became fashionable again in the 18 and 1900s. There is something both sad and fitting about the fate of these structures. They were built by peasant labour. using stone quarried and shaped by people who probably could not afford good shoes. They were symbols of oppression, yes, but they were also remarkable achievements of engineering and organization. They represented centuries of human effort. And in the end, they could not withstand economics, could not withstand the shift in military technology, could not withstand the changing needs and priorities of the people who owned them. The physical manifestation of feudal power crumbled because the system it represented was crumbling. So when you visit castle ruins today, and if you ever get the chance, you should, they are haunting and beautiful. Remember what you're looking at. You are seeing the bones of a dead civilization. The medieval world, the world of knights and castles and bound peasants, ended. Not cleanly, not all at once, but it ended. And these ruins are the monuments to that ending. But endings are also beginnings. While the castles fell, towns rose. While rural manors emptied, urban centres swelled. While the old aristocracy declined, new forms of wealth and power emerged. The peasants who walked away from the decaying castles, who negotiated their freedom, who refused to accept the old terms, they were walking towards something, toward cities, toward trade, toward guilds and apprenticeships and opportunities that had not existed for their grandparents. So let us follow them. Let us see where the peasants went when they left the manor. Let us explore the great migration from countryside to town that transformed Europe between 1400 and 1600. Because that migration, that movement of people from field to city, created the world we recognize as modern, created the beginning of urban culture, of wage labor, of social mobility, created the possibility that you could be something other than what your parents were. And that possibility, that simple but revolutionary idea, is where the next chapter of our story begins. The road stretches ahead, dusty and uncertain. You're carrying everything you own, which is not much. A bundle of clothes, maybe a tool or two, some bread for the journey. Your children walk beside you, confused about why you are leaving the only home they have ever known. Your wife is silent, worried, but also perhaps just a little hopeful, because you're walking away from the village where your family has lived for 8 generations. You're walking toward a town you've only heard about, and you have no idea what you will find there. This scene played out thousands of times across Europe in the 1400s and 1500s. The Great Migration. From countryside to town, from field to workshop, from serf to citizen. It was one of the most significant population movements in European history, and it changed everything about how society worked. Let me tell you a specific story, because statistics only tell you so much. You need to feel what this was like. Meet Henry of Gainsthorpe. That is not his real name. We do not know his real name, but there was definitely someone like him. Gainsthorpe is a village in Lincolnshire in eastern England. In 1300 it was thriving. Maybe 30 families, good farmland, a church, a manor house, the usual medieval setup. By 1400, after the plague, maybe 15 families remained. By 1450, maybe 8 families, and by 1500, Gainsthorpe was completely abandoned, empty, a ghost village. Henry was born in 1460. His father worked a holding of about 20 acres, decent size, but the village was dying. Every year another family left. The church held services for fewer and fewer people. The manor house was partially abandoned. The Lord barely visited anymore. And then, when Henry was 25 years old, the Lord made an announcement. He was converting the entire estate to sheep pasture. Sheep. Those fluffy, docile animals that would reshape England. Here is what happened in the 1500s. Wool prices were high. Really high. Flemish weavers in the Low Countries would pay excellent money for quality English wool. And here is the thing about sheep. They do not require many workers. One shepherd can manage hundreds of sheep. Compare that to arable farming, where you need lots of people for ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting. Sheep are much more profitable per acre if you factor in labour costs. So lords across England, especially in the Midlands and the North, started converting farmland to pasture. This was called enclosure. They would enclose the old open fields, literally build fences or hedges around them, and evict the peasant families who had been farming there. Sometimes they compensated the peasants, often they did not. Legally, since the lord owned the land, he could do what he wanted with it. For Henry of Gainsthorpe, this meant his family had to leave. The land they had farmed for generations was now going to be grass for sheep. No negotiation, no alternative offered, just, you have to go. So Henry, his wife Alice, and their 2 young children packed their belongings and started walking. Where were they going? York, a city about 50 miles away. Henry had heard there was work there. Opportunities. York was a major city, a centre of trade and craft production. Surely they could find something. The journey took them 4 days. 50 miles does not sound far, but when you are walking, carrying everything you own, with small children, it is exhausting. They slept rough, under hedges, in barns when they could find sympathetic farmers. They ate what they had brought and foraged what they could find. It was late spring, fortunately. Doing this in winter might have killed them, and then they reached York. And Henry's first thought, standing at the city gate, looking at the walls and the buildings and the sheer number of people, was probably something like, "What have I done?" Because cities were overwhelming. If you had spent your whole life in a village of 8 families, seeing maybe 100 people total in your entire life, suddenly being in a city of 10,000 people was sensory overload. The noise, the smell. Oh, the smell. Medieval cities stank. Human waste, animal waste, rotting garbage, smoke from thousands of fires, industries like tanning and dyeing that produced horrific odours, the crowding, buildings built right up against each other, sometimes overhanging the narrow streets so that sunlight barely reached the ground. People everywhere, shouting, selling, arguing, living their lives in public in a way that was completely alien to someone from a quiet village. Henry and Alice managed to find a room, one room, in a tenement building shared with 3 other families. This was not uncommon. Housing in cities was expensive and scarce. Landlords subdivided buildings into the smallest possible units and rented them at high prices. Henry's family, 4 people, lived in a space maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. They cooked, ate, slept, lived their entire lives in that one room. Privacy was not a concept that applied to the urban poor, but, and this is important, they were free, legally free. York had a saying, "City air makes you free." There was an old law that if you lived in a city for a year and a day without being claimed by your lord, you became a free citizen. The city needed people, it needed workers, so it offered freedom as an incentive. Lords could technically try to reclaim runaway serfs, but in practice cities protected their residents. Too many residents, and the city lost labour. So they looked the other way. Henry found work as a day labourer, loading and unloading boats at the river, hauling goods for merchants, digging ditches, back-breaking work, and the pay was not great, maybe 3 or 4 pence per day, but it was cash, actual money, and nobody owned him. Nobody could tell him he had to work for free 3 days a week. He was selling his labour to the highest bidder. Alice found work too, spinning wool, ironically. The very wool that had displaced them from their village, she was now spinning into thread for weavers. She earned maybe 2p per day. Together they made maybe 6p on a good day. Their room cost them a penny per week. Food was expensive in the city. No more growing your own vegetables or keeping chickens. They had to buy everything: bread, ale, occasionally some cheese or vegetables. Meat was rare, a luxury. They were surviving, barely. But they were free. And their children, this is what mattered to Alice, their children had possibilities. In the village, their son would have been a peasant farmer, like his father and grandfather. In the city, he could become an apprentice, learn a trade, maybe become a craftsman, maybe even prosper. Now let me zoom out and give you the bigger picture, because Henry's story multiplied thousands of times is what reshaped Europe. Nottingham, that city we've mentioned before, is a great case study. In 1348, before the plague, Nottingham probably had about 6,000 people. By 1350, after the plague killed 60% of the population, maybe 2,500 remained. You would think, city is dead, right? Collapsed, over. But that is not what happened. By 1360, migration from the countryside had brought the population back up to maybe 4,000. By 1400, maybe 5,000. By 1500, perhaps 8,000, larger than before the plague. The city expanded. New neighbourhoods were built. The economy grew. Nottingham became a centre of wool trade and cloth production. Where did all these new people come from? From villages, from dying rural communities, from families like Henry's who had no future in the countryside but might have one in the city. This pattern repeated across Europe. Cities that had crashed during the plague recovered and grew. London went from maybe 40,000 before the plague to maybe 80,000 by 1550. Paris, Florence, Venice, Cologne all saw significant growth. Not immediately after the plague, but over the following century and a half. And this created something new, an urban working class. People who did not own land, did not farm, but worked for wages. This was different from the feudal system, fundamentally different. The feudal system was based on land and obligation. The urban system was based on cash and contract. You work, you get paid. You do not work, you do not eat. Simple. Brutal in its own way, but also liberating. Cities offered something else too. Guilds. These were organizations of craftsmen. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, bakers. Every trade had a guild. Guilds controlled who could practice the trade, maintained quality standards, set prices, and provided a form of social insurance. If a guild member died, the guild helped support his widow and children. If someone fell ill, the guild might help with costs. But guilds were exclusive. To join a guild, you typically had to complete an apprenticeship, and apprenticeships were expensive. A family had to pay a fee, sometimes a substantial one, to get their son, almost always son, rarely daughter, accepted as an apprentice. Then the boy would work for a master craftsman for 7 years, learning the trade. During this time, he received room and board, but usually no wages. After 7 years, if he passed the guild's examination, he became a journeyman, a qualified craftsman who could work for wages. And if he saved enough money and produced a masterpiece, a piece of work demonstrating his skill, he could become a master himself and take on apprentices. This system created social mobility, but it was not easy. Many apprentices never became masters. They worked as journeymen their whole lives, hired hands for wealthier craftsmen. But the possibility was there, the chance. And that chance had not existed in the feudal countryside, where your birth determined your entire life. Let me tell you about Alice's son. His name was John. When he was 12, Henry and Alice scraped together enough money, it took them 3 years of saving every spare penny, to apprentice John to a carpenter. For 7 years John barely saw his parents. He lived with his master, worked long hours, learned the trade. It was hard. His master was demanding, sometimes cruel, but John learned, and at 19 he became a journeyman. At 25, John married the daughter of another carpenter. Her father helped him set up his own workshop. At 30, John was a master carpenter with 2 apprentices of his own. He owned his workshop, his tools, a small house. He was solidly middle class. His children would grow up with full bellies and warm clothes. His grandson might even learn to read. 3 generations, from bound peasant to free labourer to skilled craftsman to prosperous tradesman. That mobility, that trajectory was new. It was the beginning of the world we recognise today. But, and we need to talk about this, city life was also dangerous. Disease was rampant. Plague kept coming back in smaller outbreaks. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. The mortality rate in cities was higher than in the countryside. So many people packed together, sharing contaminated water sources, living in filth. It was a breeding ground for disease. Crime was also a serious problem. Theft was common. Violent crime happened. Cities had night watches, groups of men who patrolled at night. But they were not very effective. If you went out after dark, you risked being robbed or worse. Women and children were especially vulnerable. Poverty was crushing for those at the bottom. If you could not work, if you were injured or sick or old, you had no safety net. The church provided some charity. Guilds helped their members. But if you were an outsider, if you had no connections, you could starve in the street and nobody would help you. The phrase "the deserving poor" comes from this era. The idea that some poor people deserved help, widows, orphans, the disabled, while others did not, the lazy, the criminal. It is a distinction we still make today, and it is just as problematic now as it was then. So cities were simultaneously places of opportunity and places of danger. You could make it big, or you could die in a gutter. The gamble must have seemed worth it to the thousands who made the journey, because they kept coming. And the villages, many withered away. Gainsthorpe, where Henry came from, is just earthworks now. You can walk through the fields and see where houses once stood, where the church was, where the manor house dominated the landscape. Little Oxenden in Northamptonshire, another abandoned village. Waram, Percy, which we keep coming back to. Abandoned by the early 1600s. Historians estimate that between 10 and 15% of English villages were completely deserted between 1350 and 1600. Hundreds of villages just gone. Some were victims of enclosure, like Gainsthorpe. Some simply could not sustain a population after the plague and slowly emptied as people left for better opportunities. Some were deliberately cleared for emparkment, as we talked about, aristocrats wanting a nice view. Each one represents dozens of families displaced, uprooted, forced to reinvent themselves somewhere new. And here is something to think about. This was traumatic. Leaving your home, your community, the land your ancestors farmed, the church where your family was baptized and married and buried, this was not easy. It was scary. It was grief-inducing. Yes, cities offered freedom and opportunity, but they also meant leaving everything familiar behind. Imagine you're 60 years old. You have lived in the same village your entire life. You've never been more than 10 miles from home, and now your children are leaving, going to the city. They come back occasionally to visit, but their lives are there now. Your grandchildren will grow up speaking with a different accent, doing work you do not understand, living in ways that are completely foreign to you. The world is changing, and you are being left behind. This generational divide, this sense of worlds colliding, is something we can relate to today, right? How many of you have grandparents who do not really understand your life, who grew up in a different world with different rules? That same dynamic was happening in the 14 and 1500s, but even more dramatically. The change from rural feudal society to urban wage labour society was seismic. By 1550, Europe looked different. Cities were bigger, more important economically and politically. The countryside was less densely populated but more commercially oriented, less subsistence farming, more production for markets, and the castles? The castles were ruins, or had been converted into country houses, or were still standing but no longer relevant. The landscape that had defined medieval Europe was giving way to something new. And this is where we need to talk about what was being built economically, because the peasants who left the manors, who walked away from the castles, who took their chances in the cities, they were not just surviving, they were creating new forms of work, new relationships, new possibilities. They were, unknowingly, building the foundations of capitalism, building the idea that you could sell your labour, that you could negotiate terms, that you could, maybe, if you worked hard and got lucky, improve your situation. This was not yet the modern world. Far from it. But it was the beginning, the first steps, and those steps were taken by ordinary people, making hard choices, taking risks, hoping for better. That is always how change happens. Not through the grand plans of kings and philosophers, but through the millions of small decisions made by people just trying to live their lives with dignity and hope. So let us look more closely at what this new world of work actually meant. Let us explore how labour transformed from obligation to commodity, how the job market emerged, and how this strange new system, capitalism, though nobody called it that yet, began to take shape in the ruins of feudalism. Here is something remarkable that we take completely for granted today. You can quit your job. You can walk into your boss's office and say, "I am leaving." You can negotiate your salary. You can look for better opportunities. You can change careers entirely if you want. This seems normal to us, obvious even. But in the feudal world, none of this was possible. You were born into your work, and that was that. So when did having a job become a thing? When did labour become something you could sell, negotiate, walk away from? The answer is gradually, painfully, over the century after the plague. And the process created something we now call the job market. But at the time, it just felt like chaos. Like everything familiar was falling apart and nobody knew what would replace it. Let me introduce you to someone who lived through this transformation. Her name was Marjorie Kempe. Now, Marjorie is actually famous, sort of. She's one of the only medieval English women whose autobiography survived. She dictated it since she could not write, and it is a wild document full of religious visions and travels and drama. But buried in all of that are details about her economic life that are absolutely fascinating. Marjorie was born around 1373 in Lynn, a prosperous port town in Norfolk, England. Her father was a prominent merchant and town official. She was not nobility, but she was not poor either. Solid middle class. She married a man named John Kemper, and here is where it gets interesting. After having 14 children, yes, 14, and she survived childbirth every time, which is frankly miraculous, Marjorie decided she wanted to run her own businesses. Her first business was brewing. She set up a brewery, hired workers, and produced ale. This was not unusual. Women ran many small businesses in medieval towns, brewing, baking, textile work. But Marjorie's brewery failed. In her autobiography, she blames it on pride and says God was teaching her humility. but reading between the lines, it sounds like she probably just was not very good at business management. So she tried again. This time she set up a mill for grinding grain, powered by horses. She hired workers and a manager. This business also failed, for similar reasons. But here is what fascinates me. She could do this. She could start businesses, hire workers, pay wages. A woman, running commercial enterprises, employing people, trying to make a profit. This would have been much harder, maybe impossible, a century earlier. The feudal system was not designed for entrepreneurship. It was designed for stability, for everyone staying in their assigned role. But by the late 1400s, that system was gone or dying, and people like Marjorie were filling the void with new economic forms. So what were these new forms? What did the world of work actually look like after feudalism started to collapse? Let me break it down, because there were several different systems operating simultaneously, and understanding them helps us see how we got from there to here. First, sharecropping. This was actually very old, but it became more common after the plague. Here is how it worked. A landowner, maybe a lord, maybe a wealthy peasant who had accumulated land, would rent out a plot to a farmer. But instead of charging cash rent, they would take a share of the crop, usually 1/3 or 1/2. So if you grew 30 bushels of wheat, 15 or 20 went to the landowner, and you kept the rest. From the farmer's perspective, this had advantages. You did not need cash up front. If the harvest failed, you did not owe anything. You both suffered. It was risk sharing. From the landowner's perspective, they got a direct stake in the harvest and did not have to worry about collecting cash rents from people who might not have any. Sharecropping was especially common in southern Europe, Italy, southern France, Spain. It lasted in some places into the 20th century, and we should note, sharecropping could be exploitative. If the landowner controlled the market where you sold your crops, they could manipulate prices. If you needed to borrow seeds or tools and the landowner provided them, you went into debt. Some sharecroppers were barely better off than serfs, but at least theoretically, the relationship was contractual. You could leave when the contract ended. You were not bound for life. Second, cash rent. We have talked about this already, but it became increasingly dominant. You rent land, you pay a fixed sum per year, and what you do with that land is your business. This was the most common arrangement in England and parts of France by 1500. The advantage for farmers was predictability and autonomy. You knew what you owed. If you had a great harvest, you kept the profit. You could decide what to grow, how to grow it. The disadvantage was risk. If the harvest failed, you still owed rent, and if you could not pay, you could be evicted. Third, wage labour. This is what we think of as normal today. You work, someone pays you for your time or your output. Hourly wages, daily wages, piecework. All these emerged in the 14 and 1500s. Wage labour was most common in cities, but it also happened in the countryside. Harvest time especially required lots of temporary workers, and people would travel from farm to farm, hiring themselves out. The daily wage for an unskilled labourer in England around 1500 was about 4 pence. A skilled craftsman might earn 6 or 8 pence. You could survive on this barely if you worked consistently. But most wage labour was irregular. You worked when work was available. In the winter, there might be no work for weeks. You had to save during the busy season to get through the slack season, and if you got sick or injured and could not work, you were in serious trouble. Women's work deserves special attention because it was everywhere but often invisible. Women could not join most guilds. They were excluded from many trades. But they worked constantly. Spinning wool was the most common occupation for women. Almost every woman who was not wealthy spent part of her day spinning. It was so ubiquitous that spinster became the term for an unmarried woman, because spinning was what women did. Spinning paid very badly, maybe 1 or 2 pence per day if you worked all day. It was tedious, repetitive work, but it was essential. All cloth started with someone spinning wool or flax into thread. The entire textile industry, which was one of the biggest industries in medieval Europe, depended on women's low-paid labour. Women also worked as servants, laundresses, seamstresses, midwives, nurses, alewives, running taverns, market sellers. They did invisible labour like hauling water, which in a world without plumbing was essential and exhausting. They raised children while also working for income, and they were almost always paid less than men for comparable work. This was not an accident. This was social structure. Women were considered less valuable workers, so their labour was paid less. Sound familiar? Let me tell you about one specific transformation that shows how the whole system was changing: the rise of specialized labour. In the feudal system, peasants were generalists. You farmed, but you also did a bit of carpentry, a bit of blacksmithing, whatever was needed. You were not excellent at anything, but you could do many things adequately. After the plague, as labour became valuable, specialization increased. If you were really good at something, you could make that your whole occupation. Let me give you an example. Thatching roofs was always necessary. Most buildings had thatched roofs. Before, peasants thatched their own roofs and maybe helped neighbours. But by 1500, professional thatchers were common. Men who did nothing but thatch roofs, who travelled from village to village, who had specialised tools and techniques. They could thatch a roof in a fraction of the time it would take an amateur, and they did it better. So people paid them. Same with other specialties. Professional hedge layers, who could create the dense living fences that marked property boundaries. Professional well diggers, professional slaughterers, professional carters who transported goods. Each specialty became a trade, often with its own informal standards and networks. This is the beginning of economic efficiency through specialization. Adam Smith would write about this in the 1700s. The pin factory example, where dividing labour into specialized tasks dramatically increases productivity. But it was already happening in the 1500s, and it was driven by the labour shortage. When workers are scarce, you want to use them efficiently. Specialization is efficient. Now let me tell you about social mobility, because this is where things get really interesting. In the feudal system, your birth determined your life. Peasant child becomes peasant adult, becomes peasant parent of peasant children, forever. But in the post-plague world, mobility became possible. Difficult, unlikely, but possible. I want to tell you about a real family, documented in historical records. The Paston family of Norfolk, England. In the early 1400s, Clement Paston was a peasant farmer. His son, William Paston, managed to get an education, probably through the church, became a lawyer and made good money. William's sons became gentry. One married into the nobility. Within 3 generations, peasant to noble. This was rare, but it happened. Or consider the other direction. Noble families fell. If a lord went bankrupt, and many did, his children might end up working for wages. The rigid hierarchy of feudalism was dissolving. Class still mattered enormously. Most people stayed in the class they were born into, but the possibility of movement existed, and that was new. Let me talk about contracts, because this is crucial. In the feudal system, relationships were based on status and custom. You were a villain, therefore you owed weak work. No negotiation, no contract. Just, this is what villains do. But in the new system, relationships were contractual. You and your employer agreed on terms, wages, hours, duration. If either party violated the contract, the other could seek remedy. This might sound obvious to you, but it was revolutionary. A contract assumes both parties have agency. Both can negotiate. Both can walk away if terms are not met. This is fundamentally different from a relationship based on submission and command. Of course, the reality was messier than the theory. Employers had much more power than workers. If you needed a job desperately and many others were competing for the same job, you had little negotiating power. But still, the framework was different, and frameworks matter. Let me give you a comparison that might resonate. Think about modern labour disputes. Workers demanding higher wages, better conditions, the right to organise. Employers arguing that wages are set by the market, that businesses cannot afford to pay more, that workers should be grateful to have jobs at all. This dynamic started in the 14 and 1500s. The language is different, but the conflict is the same. Who has the right to set the terms of work? Medieval workers understood this. When they demanded higher wages after the plague, when they negotiated for better terms, when they walked away from bad employers, they were asserting that their labour had value and they had the right to negotiate its price. The Statute of Labourers tried to deny this. It tried to freeze wages and prohibit workers from leaving. But economics overwhelmed law. You cannot legislate away scarcity. Here is something I find darkly funny. Lords and merchants in the 1400s complained constantly about workers being greedy, lazy, demanding too much, not grateful enough. Sound familiar? These exact complaints get made today. Nobody wants to work anymore. Workers are too entitled. Wage demands are unrealistic. It is the same script, just updated with different costumes. But workers in the 1400s were not being unreasonable. They were responding to changed circumstances. When your labour is valuable, demanding fair compensation is not greed. It is economics. And when employers try to suppress wages below market value, resistance is rational. I want to talk about one more thing, the psychological shift. Moving from serf to worker required a change in how you thought about yourself. A serf's identity was tied to the land, to the lord, to a fixed place in the hierarchy. A worker's identity is tied to their labour, to their skills, to their ability to sell those skills. This is liberating but also alienating. Liberating because you are not bound. You can leave. You can change. Alienating because your value is now measured entirely in economic terms. You're worth what someone will pay you. If nobody will pay you, you have no value. This is still how we think today. What do you do? Is often the first question we ask when meeting someone. And what we really mean is, what do you do for money? How do you earn your living? This was new in the 1500s. Identity based on economic function rather than birth or status, and it had profound effects. It made class more fluid but also more anxious. You could rise, but you could also fall. You had to constantly prove your worth through your labour. Does this sound like modern capitalism to you? It should, because what we are watching is capitalism being born, not fully formed, not the industrial capitalism of the 1800s, but the basic structure, labour as commodity, wages determined by supply and demand, contractual relationships, competition for work, social mobility based on economic success. All of this emerged in the ruins of feudalism, and it happened because peasants, when given the chance, refused to accept the old terms. They negotiated, they demanded, they walked away when treated badly. They used their leverage, and slowly, deal by deal, negotiation by negotiation, they built a new system. Was this new system better? In some ways, yes. Freedom to move and negotiate is genuinely valuable. The possibility of improving your situation is real. But capitalism creates its own forms of oppression. Wage slavery is not identical to serfdom, but it has its own hardships: economic insecurity, exploitation, the constant pressure to work or starve. The New World had new problems. But here is what matters. Change was possible. The system that had seemed eternal had fallen, and the people at the bottom had played a role in bringing it down and in building what came next. That is power. That is agency. That is the historical reality that we inherit. So as we move forward, we need to look at what all this struggle meant. What did the peasants actually achieve? Because the revolts failed, the castles crumbled, the system changed, but was it worth it? Did their resistance matter in the long run? These are the questions that bring us to the heart of what this whole story means, not just for medieval history, but for us today. Because the battles they fought are still being fought, the questions they asked are still being asked, and the courage they showed is still needed. Rebellion is contagious. Once one group of people stands up and says no more, others start thinking, why not us? Why should we accept this? And so it spread. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381 was not unique. It was part of a wave, a century-long wave of uprising that swept across Europe, each one crushed, each one seemingly futile. But together they changed everything. You know what nobody told me in school? That the peasants kept trying, again and again, even after brutal suppression, even after their leaders were executed, even knowing they would probably fail, they kept fighting. And I think that is one of the most inspiring and heartbreaking stories in history. Let me take you to France, 17 years before the English Revolt. The year is 1358. The Black Death killed maybe half of France's population a decade ago. The 100 Years' War is raging. English armies are burning French villages. French nobles are fighting each other. The king was captured by the English and is being held for ransom. The country is in chaos. Taxes are crushing. And then, in late May, the peasants of the Beauvais region north of Paris simply explode. This uprising is called the Jacquerie. The name comes from Jacques Bonhomme, basically Jack Goodfellow, which was a contemptuous nickname nobles used for peasants. Like calling all peasants Joe Average. The peasants took the name and made it their own. What sparked it? A minor incident like most revolutions. Some nobles demanded that peasants help fortify a castle against English raiders. The peasants had already been taxed heavily for the war effort. They had already watched their crops burned by passing armies. They had already buried half their families from the plague. And now the nobles wanted free labour to protect castles that had done nothing to protect them? They refused, and when the nobles tried to force them, the peasants attacked. They killed the nobles, and then it spread. Within days, thousands of peasants across northern France were in open revolt. But here is where the Jacquerie gets dark, really dark. Because this revolt was more violent than the English one we talked about. The French peasants were not just demanding rights, they were seeking revenge, and they got it brutally. Contemporary chronicles, mostly written by nobles or clergy, so definitely biased, describe peasants burning castles with the nobles' families inside, raping noble women, killing children, killing. One account describes a group of peasants who captured a knight, roasted him alive on a spit in front of his wife and children, and then gang-raped the wife, and forced her to eat some of her husband's flesh before killing her. Now, we need to be careful with these accounts. Medieval chroniclers loved gruesome stories and often exaggerated atrocities for dramatic effect. But even if only some of these stories are true, the Jacquerie involved serious atrocities. This was not a disciplined uprising with clear political goals. This was rage. Pure, accumulated rage exploding without direction or control. The nobles responded in kind. Charles the Bad, King of Navarre, and believe me, he earned that nickname, led a force of armoured knights against the peasant bands. At the Battle of Mello on June 10, 1358, professional soldiers slaughtered thousands of poorly armed peasants. It was not even close. Peasants with farm tools against trained knights in armour. Massacre. The leader of the Jacquerie, a man named Guillaume Carle, tried to negotiate. He met with Charles the Bad under a flag of truce. Charles promptly had him arrested, tortured, and executed. The noble repression that followed was vicious. They killed not just rebels, but anyone suspected of sympathy with the revolt. Estimates suggest 20,000 peasants were killed in the uprising and its aftermath. And what did the Jacquerie achieve? Officially, nothing. The nobles won completely. The social order was restored. Taxes continued. Peasants remained oppressed. The revolt failed utterly. But, and this is important, it terrified the nobility. It showed them that peasants were capable of coordinated violence. That pushed too far, the people at the bottom would rise up. This fear influenced how nobles treated peasants for generations. More carrot, less stick. Not because they became more compassionate, but because they were scared. Let me tell you about another uprising, this one in Florence, Italy in 1378, the Ciompi Revolt. Ciompi were wool workers, the lowest class of textile workers, doing the dirtiest, hardest jobs for minimal pay. They were not allowed to form guilds. They had no political representation. They were essentially the urban equivalent of serfs. In July 1378, the Ciompi revolted. They seized control of Florence's government for several weeks. They demanded the right to form guilds. They demanded debt forgiveness. They demanded political representation. And for a brief, shining moment, they got it. Florence's government granted their demands. The Ciompi formed their own guilds and entered city government. But it did not last. Within months, the wealthier guilds, merchants, bankers, established craftsmen, organized a counter-revolt. They crushed the Ciompi. The leaders were executed or exiled. The Ciompi guilds were dissolved. Everything returned to how it was before. Failure, right? Except the memory persisted. The idea that even the lowest workers could organize, could make demands, could briefly hold power, that idea did not die with the revolt. It influenced labor movements for centuries. Are you seeing the pattern? England, 1381, peasants revolt, fail, leaders executed. France, 1358, peasants revolt, fail, massacred. Italy, 1378, workers revolt, fail, suppressed. Over and over, different countries, different years, same story. They fought, they lost, but the revolts kept happening. Flanders, 1323 to 1328, series of peasant and worker uprisings. Germany, 1431, the Poor Conrad Rebellion. Spain, multiple uprisings in the 1400s. It was like Europe was simmering, and every few years it would boil over in another place. And then came the big one. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525. This was not just a revolt. This was a war. A genuine, large-scale conflict that at its peak involved maybe 300,000 people. It was the largest popular uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. What sparked it? Lots of things. Economic oppression. German peasants faced particularly harsh conditions. Religious tension. This was right after Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, And Luther's teachings about Christian freedom inspired many peasants to think they deserved social freedom too. And accumulated frustration, generations of it. In 1524, peasant bands began forming across southern and central Germany. They created lists of demands. The 12 Articles of the Swabian Peasants is the most famous, a written manifesto of what they wanted. The right to choose their own pastors, the end of serfdom, fair rents, access to forests and streams for fishing and gathering wood. Basic stuff. Reasonable stuff. They tried negotiating, some nobles agreed to negotiate, but then the peasants started burning castles and monasteries. The violence escalated, and the nobles decided this needed to be crushed. The German princes raised armies, professional soldiers, well-equipped, well-trained. In battle after battle through 1525, they systematically defeated peasant forces. The peasants fought bravely. Some battles were close, but ultimately pitchforks and determination cannot overcome cavalry and cannons. The decisive battle was at Frankenhausen in May 1525. The peasant leader, Thomas Müntzer, a radical preacher who believed God was on their side, led about 8,000 peasants against a combined army of princes. The princes' forces had artillery. They slaughtered the peasants. Müntzer was captured, tortured, and beheaded. The repression was savage. Estimates suggest 100,000 peasants died. 100,000. That is the population of a medium-sized city today. Villages that had supported the revolt were burned. Leaders were executed publicly, often in deliberately cruel ways to make examples of them. Peasants were forced to swear oaths of submission and pay heavy fines. And Luther, Martin Luther, the religious reformer who had inspired some of these peasants with talk of Christian freedom, came out against them. He wrote a pamphlet called Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants, urging the princes to stab, smite, slay the rebels. Luther believed in spiritual freedom, but he sided with the authorities on social order. The peasants felt betrayed, and honestly they were. The German Peasants' War failed. Completely. Conditions for German peasants arguably got worse afterward. Nobles, having won decisively, felt emboldened to crack down harder. Serfdom in parts of Germany intensified, so after all this, the Jacquerie, the Chompy Revolt, the English Peasants' Revolt, the German Peasants' War, dozens of smaller uprisings, what was the point? They all lost. The leaders were killed. The demands were rejected. The social order was restored. From a purely military and political standpoint, every single one of these revolts was a failure. And yet, Europe in 1600 looked nothing like Europe in 1300. Serfdom had declined or disappeared in Western Europe. Peasants had more rights. Labour was treated more as a commodity to be negotiated than as an obligation to be extracted. The castles had crumbled. The old feudal order was dead or dying. How did this happen if the revolts all failed? Because military defeat is not the same as complete failure. These revolts changed the calculus for the ruling class. They showed that there were limits to how far you could push people, that pushing too hard meant violence, destruction, chaos, that maybe, just maybe, it was better to compromise a little than to risk losing everything. Think about it from a lord's perspective. You can try to squeeze every last bit of labour and money from your peasants, but if you push too hard they might revolt, and even if you crush the revolt your property gets damaged. Your crops get burned, you have to pay soldiers, you might get killed in the fighting. The risk-reward calculation changes, so lords started negotiating, grudgingly, angrily, always trying to give as little as possible, but negotiating. Because the alternative, the possibility of their castle burning with them inside it, was too terrifying to ignore. Here is a question for you. When is a lost battle actually a victory? When the losing side changes what the winning side is willing to risk to maintain control. When the mere possibility of resistance makes the oppressor hesitate. The peasants who fought in these revolts did not achieve their immediate goals, but they achieved something bigger. They made continued oppression costly and risky, and that changed everything. Let me tell you about the role of the church in all this, because it is complicated and important. On one hand, the church preached submission. Accept your lot. Your reward is in heaven. Rebellion is a sin. Many clergy sided with the nobles during uprisings. Some even participated in the military suppression. But on the other hand, some clergy supported the peasants. We talked about John Ball in England, the radical priest who preached equality. There were others like him, Thomas Müntzer in Germany, many local priests who were closer to peasant communities than to noble ones, and who sympathized with their struggles. And Christianity itself contains radical ideas. All humans are equal in God's eyes. The meek shall inherit the earth. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple. These are not exactly conservative, establishment-friendly teachings. Peasants who took Christianity seriously could find plenty of scriptural support for challenging unjust authority. The church hierarchy hated this, of course. They tried to suppress radical interpretations. They imprisoned and executed radical preachers. But ideas, once released, are hard to contain. The Reformation, starting in 1517, shattered church unity and created space for even more radical religious and social ideas. The Anabaptists, for example, believed in communal property and rejection of all secular authority. They were brutally suppressed, but their ideas influenced later movements. So what is the lesson from all these failed revolts? I think there are several. First, change is slow, painfully slow. People fought and died in 1358 in France. The system they were fighting against did not end until decades later, and even then only partially. Justice delayed is justice denied, yes. But delayed justice is still better than no justice. The fight matters even if you do not live to see the victory. Second, losing is not always losing. These revolts failed in the sense that they did not achieve their immediate demands, but they succeeded in making oppression more difficult and more costly. They succeeded in showing that resistance was possible. They planted seeds that bore fruit generations later. Third, solidarity matters. The revolts that lasted longest, that achieved the most, were the ones where people organized across occupations and regions. The English Peasants' Revolt united rural peasants and urban workers. The German Peasants' War spread across multiple regions because the underlying grievances were shared. Isolated resistance gets crushed. Connected resistance has a chance. Fourth, the powerful will use overwhelming violence to maintain control, but violence has limits. You can kill the rebels, but you cannot kill the idea of rebellion. You can execute the leaders, but more leaders emerge. You can restore order, but the memory of resistance persists, and that memory is dangerous. Does any of this sound relevant to today? I think it does. We still have inequality. We still have people at the bottom fighting for better treatment. We still have authorities responding with force. We still have movements that seem to fail, but plant seeds for future change. The specifics are different. Medieval peasants facing feudal lords versus modern workers facing corporations. But the fundamental dynamics are similar. People with power rarely give it up willingly. They have to be forced, through pressure, through resistance, through the threat that maintaining the status quo is more costly than reforming it. The peasants of medieval Europe understood this. They fought. knowing they would probably lose because not fighting meant accepting intolerable conditions forever, and their fighting, their losing, their dying, it mattered. It changed what was possible. It opened space for the generations that followed to push further. So I want you to remember these people, the ones who revolted and lost, Guillaume Carle tortured and executed after the Jacquerie, Thomas Münzer beheaded after Frankenhausen, the thousands whose names we do not know, who fought and died and were forgotten. They deserve to be remembered, not as failures, but as people who refused to accept injustice, who fought for dignity, who made the world slightly better for those who came after. Because here is the truth, we owe them. The rights we have, the freedoms we enjoy, the ability to negotiate our work and change our situations, none of that was given freely. It was fought for, by people who mostly lost their battles, but whose cumulative resistance made our victories possible. That is the legacy. That is what matters. And now we need to see what that legacy created. We need to look at what the world built on their struggles actually became. Because all of this resistance, all this fighting, all this slow, grinding change, it led somewhere. It created the possibility of a different kind of society, one where social mobility was real, where freedom was possible, where the future could be different from the past. So let us see what they built. Let us honor their struggle by understanding where it led. Now let me tell you about the nightmare, the alternative history, the version of events where everything went wrong and freedom did not win. Because while Western European peasants were slowly gaining their liberty, in Eastern Europe, something horrifying was happening. Peasants were losing what little freedom they had. They were being pushed into a form of bondage that was, in some ways, worse than anything medieval serfdom had ever been. This is the story nobody talks about, the second serfdom. And it is crucial to understand because it shows us something terrifying. Progress is not inevitable. Freedom can be reversed. What happened in Russia, Poland, Hungary, and parts of Germany proves that when the powerful are united and willing to use overwhelming force, they can win. Completely. For centuries. Let me take you to Russia in the year 1500. The Black Death hit Russia just like it hit Western Europe, though maybe a bit later and less severely. The population dropped. Labour became scarce. By all logic, by all the economic principles we have been discussing, Russian peasants should have gained leverage just like English or French peasants did. They should have been able to demand better terms, higher wages, more freedom. Instead, the opposite happened. Russian nobles looked at what was happening in Western Europe and said, "Absolutely not. We are not letting this happen here." And they had the power to enforce that decision because Russian society was structured differently in crucial ways. First, the Russian monarchy was weaker and more fragmented than Western European monarchies. There was no strong central authority that could play nobles and peasants off against each other. The Tsar needed the nobles to govern the vast Russian territory, so he could not afford to antagonize them. The nobles, therefore, had much more unchecked local power than their Western counterparts. Second, Russian nobles were more unified. They had a shared class interest in maintaining control over peasants. They communicated with each other. They coordinated. When peasants in one region tried to demand better conditions or leave for better opportunities, neighbouring nobles would cooperate to stop them. They would return runaways. They would collectively refuse to offer better terms. Unity among oppressors is devastatingly effective. Third, there were fewer cities and towns in Russia. In Western Europe, peasants could flee to urban centres. The 1 year and a day rule gave them freedom if they could reach a city and stay there. But Russia had fewer cities, and those cities were less autonomous. The nobles' power extended into urban areas more than in the West. There were fewer escape routes, and fourth, and this is really important, Russian nobles were willing to use extreme violence to maintain control, not just during revolts, all the time, as a constant ongoing enforcement mechanism. If you tried to leave, you were hunted down and punished brutally. If you complained, you were beaten. If you tried to organize resistance, you were killed. The level of violent coercion was higher and more consistent than in Western Europe. So what happened? Starting in the late 1500s and accelerating through the 1600s, Russian peasants were systematically reduced to a status that historians call the second serfdom, to distinguish it from medieval serfdom. But honestly, calling it serfdom is too gentle. This was closer to slavery. Let me tell you about a man named Ivan. Not a real specific person. We do not have those kinds of detailed records for Russian peasants, but a composite based on what we know. Ivan lives in a village in central Russia in 1600. His great-great-grandfather, back in the 1400s, had been a free peasant. He could move if he wanted. He paid rent but had some legal rights. He was poor, life was hard, but he was not property. Ivan is property. Legally, explicitly, he belongs to the landowner, a noble named Count Dmitri. Ivan cannot leave the estate. He cannot marry without the Count's permission. His children automatically become the Count's property at birth. The Count can sell Ivan, can split up his family, can punish him however he sees fit short of killing him, and even killing, honestly, often went unpunished if the victim was just a serf. Ivan owes 3 days of labour per week? No. Ivan owes whatever labour the Count demands. Sometimes it is 3 days, sometimes it is 5 days, sometimes during planting or harvest, it is every day, all day, for weeks. And Ivan has no recourse. No court will hear his complaint. No law protects him. The Count can, and does, demand other things too. When Ivan's daughter turned 15, the Count exercised what was euphemistically called the Lord's right to rape her. This was not legal officially, but who would stop him? Ivan could not. The local authorities worked for the Count. The Church was often complicit. Many monasteries and bishops owned serfs themselves and treated them just as badly. If Ivan tries to run away, and some serfs did try, fleeing to the southern borderlands to Siberia, anywhere beyond the reach of their lords, and he is caught, the punishment is savage. He might be branded, beaten until he cannot walk, have his tendons cut so he cannot run again. The brutality was not accidental. It was policy. Fear was the foundation of the system. Now you might be thinking, surely there were laws, limits, some legal framework. There was, but it made things worse, not better. In 1549, Tsar Ivan IV, yes, Ivan the Terrible, and he earned that name, issued a law code that eliminated the traditional period when peasants could legally move between estates. Before, there had been a 2-week period around St. George's Day in November, when peasants could leave if they had paid their debts. It was restricted, but it was something. Ivan IV ended it. Peasants were now permanently bound to the estate where they lived. They literally could not leave, ever, and their children and their children's children would be bound there too. Then, in 1649, Tsar Alexei issued a new law code that went even further. It declared serfdom hereditary and permanent. It said there was no time limit for hunting down runaways. A serf who escaped could be tracked down and returned to his lord 10 years later, 20 years later, at any time. It removed any remaining legal distinctions between serfs and slaves. By 1700, maybe 90% of the Russian peasant population were serfs, and their conditions were degrading. The 18th century saw nobles gain even more power. Empress Catherine the Great, who is often portrayed as an enlightened ruler, actually strengthened serfdom. She gave away huge numbers of state peasants to her favourites as rewards. Hundreds of thousands of people given away like party favours. Russian serfs in the 18th century could be sold separately from the land, just sold like cattle. Newspapers ran advertisements. For sale, 2 serfs, experienced field workers. Families were split up. Children sold away from parents. The horror of American slavery had a direct parallel in Russian serfdom, and it lasted, and lasted, through the 1700s, through the 1800s. While Western Europe was industrializing, while America was fighting a civil war over slavery, Russian serfdom continued. It was not abolished until 1861. 1861. That is the year the American Civil War started. That is well into the age of photography and telegraphs and railroads. Tsar Alexander II finally abolished serfdom in 1861, not out of moral conviction, but because Russia had lost the Crimean War and the whole system was clearly dysfunctional. And even then, the terms of emancipation were terrible. Serfs were technically freed but had to buy their land from their former masters at inflated prices, going into debt that took generations to pay off. Many remained tied to the land, just under different legal arrangements, so from 1500 to 1861, 361 years, Russian peasants lived under this brutal system while their Western European counterparts were gaining freedom. 3.5 centuries of oppression. Can you imagine? 10, 12, 15 generations of people born into bondage, living in bondage, dying in bondage, with no hope that their children would see anything different. Poland and Hungary had similar systems, though not quite as extreme as Russia. The pattern was the same. After the plague, instead of peasants gaining leverage, nobles cracked down. They created the Gutsherrschaft system in Eastern Europe, large estates worked by bound peasants who provided forced labour. The lords produced grain for export to Western Europe, using what amounted to slave labour. And here is the cruel irony. Western Europe's growing prosperity partly depended on Eastern Europe's oppression. Western cities needed grain. Eastern European nobles provided it cheaply because they did not have to pay their workers. The rising standard of living in Amsterdam or London was subsidized by the suffering of Polish and Russian serfs. Global economics has always been morally complicated. So why did this happen? Why did Eastern Europe go backward while Western Europe moved forward? Historians debate this endlessly, but several factors seem crucial. Geography. Eastern Europe had fewer natural boundaries, more open land. This made it easier for peasants to flee, so nobles had to be more aggressive about preventing flight. It also meant fewer fortified cities serving as refuges. Political structure. Western European monarchs were stronger and more centralized by 1500. They had incentives to limit noble power and could play different classes against each other. Eastern European monarchs were weaker and more dependent on noble support. Economic incentives. The grain trade to Western Europe was incredibly profitable for Eastern nobles. The economic incentive to maximize production using cheap labor was enormous. Western nobles facing different economic conditions found different arrangements more profitable. Military power. Eastern European nobles had private armies and were willing to use them against peasants consistently and brutally. The balance of coercive force favored the nobility more than in the West. But I think the most important factor was will. Eastern European nobles wanted to maintain the old system and were willing to do whatever it took to enforce it. They were not divided. They did not hesitate. They crushed resistance immediately and savagely, and they won. This is the lesson that keeps me up at night. Freedom is not inevitable. Progress is not guaranteed. Every right we have, every freedom we enjoy, exists because someone fought for it, and because others continue to defend it. If the powerful are united and determined, they can take it all back. Russia proved this. Think about it. Russian peasants in 1500 had similar circumstances to English peasants. Labour shortage, economic leverage, reasons to hope for better conditions. But a century later, English peasants had more freedom and Russian peasants had less. The difference was not technology or economics, it was power. Who was organised? Who was willing to fight? Who won? And here is what really haunts me. The Russian serfs resisted. They revolted, multiple times. Major uprisings in 1670 to 1671 under Stenka Razin, in 1773 to 1775 under Pugachev. These were huge revolts, involving tens of thousands of people. They captured cities, briefly. They terrified the nobility, and they lost. The Russian state brought in armies, professional soldiers with cannons. They massacred the rebels. Pugachev was captured, brought to Moscow in a cage, and executed publicly. The repression was overwhelming, and after each revolt failed, conditions got worse, not better. The nobles tightened control even more. So the Russian serfs were not passive. They were not accepting their fate. They fought as bravely as English or German peasants. But they lost more completely because the system they were fighting was more unified and more brutal. Does this sound familiar? Can you think of examples in recent history where people fought for freedom and lost? Where authoritarian systems crushed resistance and remained in power for decades? It happens. It has always happened. The arc of history does not automatically bend toward justice. It bends toward whatever people with power want, unless others fight hard enough and smart enough to bend it the other way. I want you to sit with this for a moment. Imagine being born into this system, knowing your great-great-great-great-grandfather had been free, knowing that in other parts of Europe people like you had rights, could own property, could choose their work, and you are property, you own nothing, you choose nothing. Your children will be born into the same bondage, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. For 300 years that was the reality for Russian peasants, and yet, and this is important, they survived. They maintained their culture, their communities, their humanity. They found ways to resist within the system. They helped each other. They preserved songs and stories and traditions. They never fully submitted, even when they could not openly rebel. The abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861 came too late and was too limited, but it came partly because the serfs never stopped pushing back. Every small act of resistance, every work slow down, every instance of running away, every revolt, it all added up. It all made the system more expensive to maintain, more unstable, more fragile. And eventually it cracked. But it took 3 centuries. That is the terrifying part. 300 years of bondage because the powerful won the early battles and maintained their grip through organized violence. Think about what that means. If the English or French nobles had been more united, more ruthless, more willing to use overwhelming force, Western Europe could have looked like Russia. You could have been born into serfdom that lasted until your grandparents' generation. We avoid that fate not through any natural law or historical inevitability, but because our ancestors fought and sometimes won, and because subsequent generations defended what was gained. Freedom is fragile. It requires constant effort to maintain and expand. The moment we stop fighting for it, the moment we assume it is permanent and natural, we risk losing it. So I want to honor the Russian serfs who lived and died in bondage, who never saw freedom but fought for it anyway, hoping their descendants might have better lives, who maintained their dignity in degrading circumstances, who proved that the human spirit cannot be fully broken even by centuries of oppression. They deserve to be remembered, not as passive victims, but as people who resisted in whatever ways they could, for as long as they could, against a system designed to crush them completely. And their story teaches us, never take freedom for granted, never assume progress is inevitable, never stop fighting for what is right, even when the odds seem overwhelming. Because the alternative, 300 years of bondage, is too horrific to accept. The difference between freedom and slavery can come down to whether people organize, whether they resist, whether they refuse to accept the unacceptable. That choice is still ours to make every day. So now, as we near the end of our journey, we need to ask the final question. What did all of this mean? All the struggle, all the revolts, all the slow grinding change. What world did it create? What do we inherit from the peasants who fought, from the castles that fell, from the system that collapsed? Because the answers matter. They matter for understanding our past, yes. But more importantly, they matter for understanding our present and shaping our future. Stand with me in a field, an ordinary field in Yorkshire, England. Grass rolls gently across hillocks and depressions. Sheep graze peacefully. The wind moves through the landscape carrying no sound but birdsong. You would never know, looking at this quiet pastoral scene, that you are standing in the middle of a revolution, that beneath your feet are the foundations of 40 houses, that 700 years ago this was Waram, Percy, a living village, that people were born here, lived here, loved here, struggled here, died here. This is where we began our journey, hours ago, with Agnes and Thomas in 1349, refusing the steward, discovering they had power, and now we are here, in the present, standing in the ruins of their world. And I want to tell you what they left us, what all of those forgotten peasants, all those lost revolts, all those centuries of struggle, what they created. Because here is the thing, you live in the world they made. Every single day, in ways you probably never think about, you benefit from what they fought for. And I think it is time we acknowledge that debt. Let me start with something simple. You have weekends, right? Saturday and Sunday off, unless you work weekends. But even then, the idea of a 2-day break is culturally embedded. Where does that come from? Medieval peasants had more days off than you might think. All those church feast days, maybe 60 or 70 per year. But those were religious observances, not workers' rights. The modern weekend, the idea that workers deserve regular rest, traces back to the labour movements of the 18 and 1900s. And those movements, they were built on ideas and struggles that go back to our medieval peasants. When workers in the 1800s demanded an 8-hour workday, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, they were echoing the resistance of peasants who refused to work 7 days a week for lords. When they formed unions, they were following the model of medieval guilds. When they said, "We deserve to be treated as humans, not machines," they were saying what John Ball said in 1381, "We are all equal, we all deserve dignity," or consider the minimum wage. The Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It tried to make it illegal for workers to demand more money. Sound familiar? Every argument against the minimum wage today was made in the 1400s. It will hurt businesses. Workers should be grateful to have jobs. The market should set wages, not the government. The medieval nobility made these exact arguments, and they lost, because economic reality, labour scarcity, workers with options, overwhelmed their attempts to suppress wages. Modern minimum wage laws are direct descendants of that struggle. The recognition that workers should not be paid below a certain threshold, that there are moral limits to exploitation, that human labour is not just a commodity to be purchased as cheaply as possible. These ideas were forged in the centuries after the plague, when peasants discovered they could demand better. Or think about social mobility. The idea that you can be something other than what your parents were, that your birth does not determine your entire life, that talent and effort matter more than bloodline. This was not always obvious. For most of human history, you were born into a class and you stayed there. Period. The medieval feudal system was explicitly designed this way. The three estates, those who pray, those who fight, those who work, were considered divinely ordained and permanent. But the collapse of feudalism shattered that. When peasants left manors, when they negotiated better terms, when they became craftsmen and merchants and even occasionally prosperous, they proved that social mobility was possible. And once proved possible, it became aspirational. The American dream, the idea that anyone can make it if they work hard, is a direct descendant of the post-feudal world where for the first time your future was not completely determined by your past. Now, we need to be clear. Social mobility in our world is still limited. Class barriers are real. Systemic inequality is real. The children of wealthy parents have massive advantages over the children of poor parents. We have not achieved anything close to true equality of opportunity. But the principle that mobility should be possible, that class barriers should not be absolute, that principle was established in the ruins of feudalism, and it matters. Or consider political representation. Democracy, the idea that ordinary people should have a say in how they are governed, was not a medieval concept. But the seeds were planted. When English peasants marched on London in 1381 demanding the abolition of serfdom, they were asserting that even the lowest people had political agency. They were claiming the right to petition the king, to make demands, to participate in political decisions that affected their lives. The demands were rejected, yes, but the act itself was revolutionary, and it was remembered. The levellers in the 1600s, arguing for expanded voting rights during the English Civil War, invoked the Peasants' Revolt. The Chartists in the 1800s, demanding universal male suffrage, stood in that same tradition. The suffragettes fighting for women's voting rights, same lineage. Every expansion of political rights, every movement toward democracy, traces back to people at the bottom saying, "We have a right to be heard." Let me tell you about Magna Carta, because there is a fascinating connection here. Magna Carta was signed in 1215 by King John. Not willingly, he was forced to by rebellious barons. It was initially about limiting royal power and protecting noble rights, nothing to do with peasants. But over time, Magna Carta was reinterpreted. By the 16 and 1700s, people were reading it as a statement of fundamental rights that applied to everyone, not just nobles. Clauses about due process, about not being imprisoned without trial, about justice not being denied, these were claimed as universal rights. And when people made these claims, they pointed to the tradition of resistance that included the Peasants' Revolt. They said, "Our ancestors fought for these rights, and we are continuing that fight." Is that historically accurate? Not really. The peasants in 1381 were not thinking about constitutional law, but the idea that they were, the myth that they were part of a long struggle for English liberty. That myth was powerful. It influenced the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence, with its assertion that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, is part of this tradition. The genealogy is not direct, but the ideas are connected. So when you vote, when you claim political rights, when you assert that government should represent you, you are standing on foundations built by people who probably could not read, who lived and died in obscurity, but who fought for dignity and justice. Now let me talk about labour rights, because this is where the connection is most direct. Every labour protection you have, workplace safety rules, limits on working hours, protection from arbitrary firing, the right to organise, collective bargaining, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, all of these exist because workers fought for them, and those workers were continuing a struggle that began when medieval peasants said no to unpaid labour and demanded wages. The International Workers' Day, celebrated on May 1st in most countries, not in the United States because we are weird, commemorates the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, when workers were striking for an 8-hour workday. But the demand itself, the idea that workers deserve limited hours and humane treatment, echoes back through centuries. Medieval peasants who refused to work 7 days a week, guild members who regulated working conditions, apprentices who had their hours and treatment specified by contract. The struggle is continuous. When you clock out after 8 hours and your boss cannot legally force you to keep working, thank a labour organiser. But also, understand that labour organiser was standing on the shoulders of others, reaching back through generations, all the way to peasants in the 1400s who discovered that their labour had value and they could demand to be treated accordingly. Here is something else you inherit: the idea of human rights, that people have inherent worth and dignity regardless of their social status. This was not a medieval concept. Medieval society was explicitly hierarchical. But the challenges to that hierarchy, the assertion by peasants that they were human beings deserving of respect, the revolts that said, "We will not be treated as property," these planted ideas that grew into the modern human rights framework. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in 1948, it declared, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." That is John Ball. That is when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? That is the radical claim made by medieval peasants, and then by countless others after them, that hierarchy is artificial and equality is natural. So what did the peasants achieve? Let me sum it up. They did not end oppression. We still have that. They did not create equality. We still lack that. They did not win most of their battles. But they changed what was possible. They showed that resistance was feasible. They made oppression more costly and riskier. They forced the powerful to negotiate rather than just command. They created space, small at first, for new economic and social arrangements, and those spaces grew. From 1350 to 1600, Europe transformed, not smoothly, not quickly, not completely, but profoundly. The castles fell. Serfdom ended in the West. Cities grew. Commerce expanded. Social mobility became possible. Political rights began to expand. And underneath all of it was the labour and the struggle of people who never expected to be remembered, who just wanted their children to have better lives. Have we reached the destination they were aiming for? No. We still have inequality. We still have exploitation. We still have people working multiple jobs and barely surviving. We still have systems that value profit over human dignity. We still have hierarchies based on birth and wealth and race and gender. The struggle continues, but we have made progress, real, measurable progress, and that progress was not gifted to us by benevolent rulers. It was fought for by people who believed things could be better and who were willing to risk everything to make it so. I want to go back to Waram Percy, to that quiet field, because standing there you can see the whole arc of this story. The earthworks where houses stood, the church partially standing, walls open to the sky, the manor house now just foundations, and the castle on the hill barely visible anymore. This village existed for maybe 500 years. Families lived here for generation after generation. They farmed these fields. They baptized their children in that church. They owed service to the Lord in that manor house. They lived under the shadow of that castle, and then, slowly, the village emptied. Some people left for better opportunities, some were forced out by enclosure, some simply died without children to continue the line. By 1600, Waram Percy was abandoned. By 1700, it was forgotten. By 1800, it was a curiosity. By 1900, it was an archaeological site. And now it is a memorial. Not an intentional one. Nobody built a monument to the peasants who lived here. But it is a memorial nonetheless, to a way of life that ended, to a system that collapsed, to people who lived and struggled and eventually, through their collective efforts across generations, changed the world. If you ever visit Waram Percy, and you should if you get the chance, you will see a sign that gives basic information, the dates, the history, the archaeological significance. But it will not tell you the real story. It will not tell you about Agnes and Thomas. It will not tell you about negotiations over rent and desperate attempts to make the harvest and quiet acts of resistance. It will not tell you about hopes and dreams and the simple human desire for dignity. But you know that story now. You have walked through it with me. You have seen the castles fall. You have watched the peasants discover their power. You have witnessed the revolts that failed and the negotiations that succeeded. You have seen the long, slow, grinding transformation of society, and you have seen what it cost and what it achieved. So what do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with the understanding that we are the inheritors of centuries of struggle? I think we honor it by continuing the fight. Not literally, probably. I'm not suggesting you storm any castles, but the principle, the refusal to accept injustice as permanent, the willingness to organize, to resist, to demand better, the understanding that change is possible but requires effort, that freedom is not natural but must be fought for and defended, that solidarity matters, that even losing battles can be part of winning the war. When you see inequality and think, this is not right, that is the voice of John Ball echoing through 6 centuries. When you join a union or support a strike or demand fair wages, you are walking in the footsteps of peasants who refuse to work for free. When you vote, when you protest, when you organize, you're honoring the memory of people who fought and often died for the rights you exercise casually. And when you feel powerless, when systems seem too big and entrenched to change, when the powerful seem invincible, remember the castles. Remember that massive stone fortresses that had stood for 300 years crumbled. Remember that a social system that seemed divinely ordained and permanent collapsed. Remember that people who were told they were nothing, who were legally property, who had every reason to despair, those people changed the world. It took time, it took generations, it took countless failures before the successes. But it happened. The impossible became possible. The permanent became temporary. The powerless discovered power. And we live in the world they created through that struggle. So here is my final thought. the lesson I want you to take from these hours we have spent together: history is made by ordinary people, not just by kings and generals and great leaders, by peasants and workers and people whose names are lost, by small acts of resistance that accumulate into movements, by people who refuse to accept that things must always be as they are. You are those people. Right now, in this moment, you are making history. Every choice you make about whether to accept injustice or resist it, every decision about whether to stand in solidarity with others or look away, every moment where you choose courage over fear, you are shaping the world that will be inherited by people 600 years from now. And they will judge us just as we have judged medieval society, by how we treated the people at the bottom, by how we responded to injustice, by whether we made things better or allowed them to stay the same or get worse. The castles fell because people decided they would fall, because peasants walked away, because workers demanded wages, because rebels rose up even knowing they would lose, because negotiators insisted on better terms, because thousands and thousands of ordinary people over decades and centuries pushed and resisted and changed what was acceptable. That is how systems fall. That is how progress happens, not through grand gestures by heroes, but through the accumulated efforts of people who history mostly forgets, but who collectively changed everything. You have that same power. You might not feel powerful. Medieval peasants did not feel powerful either, but they were. And so are you. The question is, what will you do with it? Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. Thank you for listening to a story that does not get told often enough. Thank you for caring about people who lived 600 years ago and whose struggles connect directly to ours today. I hope you see the world a little differently now. I hope you see the systems around you as less permanent and more fragile. I hope you feel connected to that long chain of people fighting for justice. And I hope you feel inspired to be part of that fight. The story does not end here. History does not end. The struggles continue in new forms with new challenges. And there are so many more stories to tell, stories of other revolutions, other transformations, other moments when ordinary people change the world, stories that might help us understand where we are and where we are going. So if you found this valuable, if you want to hear more stories like this, stay with me, subscribe, come back, because there is so much more to explore, so many more moments when the impossible became possible. So many more people whose courage and struggle deserve to be remembered. But for tonight, this is where we leave Agnes and Thomas, standing in their field in 1349, having just discovered they can say no, having just taken the first step on a journey that would span centuries and continents, and ultimately reshape civilization. They do not know what they have started. They are just trying to survive. Just trying to feed their children, just trying to live with dignity. But that is enough. That has always been enough. Because when millions of people decide individually and collectively that they will not accept the unacceptable, mountains move, castles fall, and the world changes. Sleep well, dream of a better world, and when you wake, remember, you have the power to help create it. Just like they did. One choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one refusal to accept injustice at a time. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.